I'd like to call this meeting of the Urbana City Council to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderpersons Chenoweth, Hayes, Roberts,
Here.
Alex,
Here.
Pat,
Present.
Whalen, Wyman,
Here.
Mayor Satterthwaite.
Here. We have a quorum. We are working off the amended agenda tonight. For those of you in the audience, if you've got an agenda, make sure it says amended agenda at the top there. I think there's some of them are available at the back if you don't have one. The first item on our agenda this evening is approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Additions or corrections? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any additions or corrections to the agenda this evening? If not, we'll go to petitions and communications. If there's anybody in the audience tonight that would like to speak to the council for a period of up to 5 minutes, go ahead and fill out one of these white cards that's at the table in the back and give it to myself or the clerk, and you'll get a chance to do so. First is Robert Michael Doyle on 105 East Green on the topic of HRO and housing. Robert, do you want to come up?
Good evening. I'm here to compliment the City Council and citizens of Urbana for something that happened 30 years ago. But to make a historical point, last week the Illinois General Assembly passed the gay rights law, finally, after 30 years of lobbying. The City of Urbana was the first to do it in the state of Illinois back in 1975. I wasn't involved in that effort. In fact, I wasn't even out when that effort started. So I only knew about it from reports from others or from reading about it. But anyway, it was passed after several attempts. In fact, it was voted down once, and it was vetoed by a mayor once, at least. One of the interesting things that happened was one of your members at that time who voted against it later came out as a gay person and is an openly gay legislature in one of the western states. Anyway, he was written up in the News Gazette several years ago. After you passed it, then as one of the things about living in Twin Cities is then Champaign worked on it for about 2 years and passed a version in 77, which I did participate in that effort, and that version was covered more area and it was more comprehensive, and also included transgendered people as well as gay people, something that is not necessarily apparent to people because the word transgender doesn't appear in the ordinance. But anyway, then Urbana amended its ordinance, and especially included housing, which had not been in the earlier one. And so the two cities since then have been very comprehensive. In fact, as far as of all the things that I've read about or seen so far, I think you have the most comprehensive human rights ordinances in the nation. And then they've also been enforced, which I feel is another important component to it. It's not enough to just have them on the books, but also to try to enforce them. In addition, I was very pleased that when we had the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, that the two cities immediately agreed that people with HIV infection or with AIDS were covered by the ordinances. This was while the states and federal government were still dithering about whether these people were covered by their rules. And so I was very pleased with that. Anyway, I just wanted to make that historical note to you on this occasion. And I want to make one comment about an item later on your agenda, and that's the ordinance having to do with housing and for unrelated people. I'd like to point out that same-sex couples are not counted as related, and I think you ought to do something about that. The simplest way would be to set up a same-sex domestic partner registry, perhaps through the city clerk's office. It could pay for itself through filing fees. There are a number of people in this town. I know personally of people with Canadian marriages I just learned of somebody with a Massachusetts marriage. We have a large foreign contingent. I won't be surprised if we don't have Danish and Norwegian civil unions and Belgian and Dutch marriages, and eventually there will be Spanish marriages. And of course, Americans can go to Canada and get married, and of course now they can go to Massachusetts, for the time being, that is. However, of course, there's no way of recognizing marriages under Illinois law, but there's certainly nothing wrong with recognizing civil unions and domestic partnerships. The University of Illinois already does it, and you could do it too, and then that would eliminate from that particular ordinance that you're planning to pass tonight what I consider an oversight. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Next is Gabe Omoosagi on High Cross Road.
Good evening. I'm glad that he mentioned a little bit about the housing thing. That's what's brought me out this cold evening. And before I start, I'd like to thank Esther for sending me that letter to clarify some things that the tenants union does. And I probably would have preferred that you told me here so we could have debated what it was all about. But it was a nice gesture, and I appreciate it. Now, this thing about the 4 unrelated people, one wonders how you define occupancy. 4 people live in the place. Their girlfriends move in, or like the previous speaker just said, somebody says he's my domestic partner, or something. I mean, how are you going to monitor that? And of course, we get. I have the house I used to live in before. It's zoned single family. It was down zoned when they did the zoning thing. And it's 1105 South Busey. Right next to it is used to be a university certified house, I think for about 16 people. It used to be called the Brown House. Across the street we have, is it the Delta House or whatever, fraternity. Right next to it we have a duplex. Next to, on the other side of the street again, we have a 4-H house. And then on the other, behind it, we have 3 sororities. I wonder if any of you would buy my house to raise your family in with all those people around you. So it's not, I don't rent to more than 4 unrelated people, but occasionally somebody will call the city, and the city will go in there and check to try to see how many people are living in there. Then of course they come to me and say, well, we're not able to prove that anybody was living in there. But it's just, you harass the tenants. Even if they moved in with their girlfriends, how do you prove that their girlfriends live there? Is it by getting mail, or they park their cars there? How do you do these things? And of course, this same city has an ordinance that the landlord must give 24-hour notice before he goes to his building. Now, what do I do if I suspect that there are more than 4 unrelated people in there? I rent it to 4 people, and somebody says there are 6 or 5. When I go there, they're not there. How do I prove it? If a girlfriend is living with her boyfriend there, of course they'll probably be in the same room. These things are difficult to prove, and of course now you want to say the fine should be on the landlord. $750, I think, was a high point. Why don't you just make it $10,000 so we know you're doing your job? And interestingly, though, I know Esther is for it. I talked to Esther about maybe 6-7 years ago about this, and you thought it was stupid for them to the 4 unrelated rule, and suddenly you are for it. The thing is, when people invest, I know some people who have made investments of just single-family homes. That is their entire livelihood. Okay, and what happens is, of course, some people try to go around it and maybe rent to 6 people, etc., etc. Well, that's not what I do. But a time will come when somebody, I don't know how you might say, Section 8 is paying quite a bit of money for 4 and 5 bedroom houses because they're very few. So you're running away from students. You don't want students in that neighborhood. Someday, somebody's going to start renting to Section 8 because Section 8 will pay more. Then you'll have Mrs. Gonzalez, who has 12 children, maybe 10 of them teenagers, running around. Or Mrs. Washington, who will have some teenage sons, a lot of brothers, hanging out, all parking old Buicks and old cars on the streets. But the state will pay for them because they have Section 8 vouchers. Okay? There are about 90-something Section 8 vouchers out there at Lakeside Terrace. And I can assure you, we always follow the money. I don't live in that neighborhood. I know lecturers live in that neighborhood, and they don't want students around them, even though that's what their livelihood is dependent on. But someday, you're going to push people so far that it would make more sense for them to rent to Section 8 than anything else. And we'll see which is worse. I don't know what the problem is. We keep revisiting these issues about zoning and changing things over and again. Can somebody please tell me how we define occupancy?
Well, Gabe, this isn't a question and answer period, but we'll
Sure,
hopefully
okay.
get to that in the staff report, because I know
Okay.
that's
It's
a question that we all struggle
okay.
with.
Sure, like I've said, and anybody that knows that usually people have friends. Our leases say that no long-term overnight guests. We say that in our leases. Well, the people in our neighborhood, I think they call themselves WUNA or whatever it is, they're very vigilant because they call the city every day. Anything happens, the garbage is not being picked up, they call the city. If they find maybe the place was rented to four guys and they see one girl there for 2 days, do they call the city? And do I get to be fined $750 for that when I have no power over that? I think you guys need to really look at it and look at situations where the landlord is not being unduly punished for something that he almost has no control over, especially because you guys have come up with a law that shows that I have to give them 24 hours before I go there. So when they violate one of the terms of their lease, I have to send them a notice that I'm coming, and before I get there, it's changed. Then when I leave, they go back to behaving in the same way, and then I get fined $750. So please take that into consideration. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. Next is Diane Marlin, 2203 Boudreaux on the U-Carts.
Hi, my name is Diane Marlin. I'm at 2203 Boudreaux Circle. I'm here to talk about the U-Carts. I read in the paper that you're considering purchasing about 570 more for something like $21,000, and I'm here to encourage you to buy 1,000 if you can. I love these things. They're the 65-gallon wheeled recycling totes with a lid. I've had one since last spring, and I think they're the best thing that's happened to recycling in Urbana since curbside pickup. I've been involved in the effort to promote recycling in this town for many, many years. I was recycling chair for Students for Environmental Concerns and chaired glass drives in the Assembly Hall parking lots where people brought their glass containers to trucks, threw them in the back of the truck, and we stood there and smashed them with tire irons. I survived that, went on to serve on the board of the governing council of the Community Recycling Center for about 10 to 12 years, and mainly was involved in publicity and education efforts there. And we went from the first drop-off at the original strawberry fields on Main Street to multiple 24-hour drop-off sites at the Jerry's IGAs. We did pilot curbside with the Boy Scouts in selected areas of town, and eventually we got to the commingled curbside pickup that's been institutionalized here in Urbana. And through it all, we always had to think about how do we get people to restart recycling and how do we encourage people to increase volume once they started. And this U-Cart is just amazing. I'm an avid recycler, and I've increased the volume of recycling since I received it. And I don't know how, but it just happened. It's easy, it makes it efficient, it's very tidy, and it is extremely convenient, and I think that's the key. So I would encourage you to purchase as many as you possibly can. I had the 15-gallon green bins that everybody has now. I used to fill 3 of those up a week, plus extra boxes and bags, and by the time you haul that out to the curb, it's 3 or 4 or 5 trips to the curb. It was a pain, but I did it. These U-Carts, it's a 1 trip to the curb. It's the same as wheeling your garbage tote out, and I think this is going to be the key to really get more and more people involved in recycling. The U-Cart is about the same size as in fact it is identical in size to my garbage tote, same size, same color, same shape. They sit right next to each other in the garage. I keep a Rubbermaid bin in my pantry, fill it up every couple days, take it out to the garage, fill it the recycling tote, and take it back to the house. And at the end of the week, you wheel the recycling tote out to the curb, you wheel the garbage can out to the curb, and you're done. So, congratulations to Public Works, to Bill Gray, to the environmental manager Rod Fletcher, who I know has been involved with recycling for many, many years. This was a wonderful program to introduce. And buy more. Take my recycling tax and buy more. And I have 3 suggestions. One is, when I was involved with the Community Recycling Center, we would sponsor Recycling Week every April, coinciding with Earth Day. And that was our big education push to try to get people to start recycling and, just generally contact the public. I think you should perhaps consider a rollout, if you will, of the recycling bins during an event close to Earth Day again this spring. Second, I think you should have these things at the farmers market, have a sample there, have a sign-up sheet, and let people see them. And once they see how convenient they're going to be, I think you'll get a greater participation. And I volunteered to staff one of these booths. I think they're just terrific. And third, but not every Saturday, just third, one thing I would suggest is, because the recycling tote is so similar to the garbage tote, once in a while somebody puts the garbage in the recycling can and the recyclables in the garbage can. So if you're going to order more, I would suggest, if it doesn't cost too much more money, to put there's a logo on the side, and it's not too big, but if you could stencil a recycling logo on the top of the lid, it would just help. But that's a small thing. Anyway, buy more, spend more. And I probably will never say that again. But when it comes to these things, I think it's going to be the single most effective and easiest way to increase recycling in this town. And I don't know, it's just amazing, but it works. So.
Okay, any questions for Diane? They have you come back and do an infomercial based on what you said. Okay, Curtis Pettyjohn has got a card here, but you want to speak at the time of the item? Okay. Anybody else in the audience for participation? Okay, council members? Yes, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I have a note from Elizabeth Cardman, who is ill and could not be here tonight. She lives at 708 West California and is one of the co-chairs of the West Urbana Neighborhood Association. Ms. Cardman says, I approve the concept of graduated fines for over-occupancy violations. Many who live near overoccupied properties will attest to the fact that this ordinance is sorely needed. The proposed ordinance, however necessary, is a punitive, reactive response to an ongoing problem. Overoccupancy is also a problem endemic to college towns. Other college towns have enacted proactive programs to address the problem. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Newark, Delaware, and Iowa City, for example, require that the landlord and all tenants sign an affidavit to the rental agreement acknowledging the legal occupancy. College towns such as Princeton, New Jersey, Newark, Delaware, and West Lafayette, Indiana, require all rental properties to be registered with the city and that the legal number of occupants be posted on the rental property. West Lafayette includes a truth in advertising clause regarding the legal number of occupants in its ordinance on rental registration. I would ask that the City Council consider making a recommendation to encourage the city to be proactive and do its best to eliminate the practice of over-occupancy from the start by supporting a proactive policy which would require affidavits on the legal number of occupants for all rentals and a rental registration program to identify rentals and regulate their legal occupancy limits. Thank you.
Anything else, Ms. Wyman?
I'd just like to ask that for next Monday's Committee of the Whole meeting, that the issue of the county's brick and mortar structure at the corner of Vine and Elm be placed on that. I received an email from Mr. Roberts regarding this issue and spoke with Attorney Holtz about it, and I'd like to have the issue for the Committee of the Whole to discuss. And I think Mr. Hayes is the chair, so if you would, no, you're not? For the following Monday, then Ms. Chenoweth, if it's all right with you, to put it on the agenda. Thank you.
We have a memo from Mr. Gray. He was going to go over that tonight. Would you rather just hear that all the next week rather than have an update on it tonight?
No, I think it's fine. Mr. Gray's already here for him to give the update. My interest in having it on next week's agenda is to be able to consider what he has to say, take in any other further comments, especially those that were written by Mr. Roberts and sent out this afternoon, that were copied to Mr. Adair, Mr. Gray, Mayor Satterthwaite, and I, and then be able to perhaps, I'd like to put something in the committee packet to suggest what alternatives we might have, including providing direction or requesting that the county take action regarding this issue.
Okay, well, we'll hear from Mr. Gray on that under reports of officers later in the agenda, and then wouldn't be any problem to put it on next week's agenda as well.
Thank you.
Any other petitions and communications from council members? All right. There's no old business, so we'll go on to the report from the standing committee, the Committee of the Whole. Ms. Chenoweth, are you the chair now?
This is correct. First, we have 2004-12-153, an ordinance amending Schedule H of Section 2393 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code requiring stop signs at a certain intersection. That intersection is McCullough Street at Briggs Street and Locust Street at Central Avenue. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have 2004-12-154, an ordinance amending Schedule L, excuse me, of Section 23-187 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code prohibiting parking in specified places. This refers to Harding Drive. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? There's no discussion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have resolution number 2005-01-01R, a resolution adopting the National Incident Management System, NIMS. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? There's no discussion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-01-004, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute agreements for use of right-of-way. This refers to 701 South Gregory Place. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Alex?
I'd just like to thank the city attorney for addressing my questions on this matter related to the expiration of the agreement, and I'm satisfied with the explanation thereof. Thank you.
Any other discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-01-005, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance. This refers to the U-Cart purchase. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion on this? Yes, Ms. Chenoweth?
Just a quick question to follow up on Ms. Marlin's comments. When all of these U-Carts are out the door and there are people who are requesting more U-Carts, is the administration's plan at that point to come back, to notify us and come back again, or to basically have a kind of maximum number of carts that would be out at any given time?
Well, obviously, we'd like to maximize it, and we're able to buy these within the current budget based on the recycling fee of $2.50. So we'll see how these go, and if they go fast enough and there's not enough money there, why we can bring it back to the council and see what the alternatives are. But Rod, the first time we got them, it was about 22,000 carts to begin with. Was that right? 2,300. And so we're quickly going through those, and so this is an additional 500 or so, and so we'll see how fast we go through that. I know not every household is going to want them if they have a smaller amount of recyclables, and so we'll just have to see how, what the demand is over the years. When did we get those that first batch, Rod? It's been May? Yeah, so it's been about 8 months or so, and so we're going through them pretty fast. And when people see their neighbors have them on the sidewalk or on the right-of-way, they say, hey, that looks like something I might want. And so we've been getting some interest by people seeing other U-Carts out. So, but when these are gone, if it looks like there's still a healthy demand, we can bring the issue back.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions or discussion?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Robbins.
I just wanted to confirm in the memorandum from December 22nd, Mr. Fletcher, you said that you thought that this number would be adequate for the next 12 months.
The recent advertising...
Rod, if you're going to ask, you want to come up to the microphone?
The recent advertising we've been getting has increased our demand considerable today. We received 67 calls today, and we have about 120 left in our existing inventory. We won't be able to get the new carts for 6 weeks at the earliest, so we'll have a little lag time there where we'll exhaust our existing supply. But as soon as we get the carts, we'll get them distributed. I guess I don't know. It will depend on people's demand. I guess I would tone down that year's supply to maybe something less. I don't know exactly what that is at this point in time. But it's certainly been an exciting opportunity for people. And as the mayor suggested, we'll see what this next shipment will last us and see what the demand is at that point in time and come back to council's need.
I think it was appropriate as we look to the upcoming budget that maybe we consider this as something that could be extended. Obviously, I think I would hope that 570 carts will hold us for a while, but if it doesn't look like we're going to make it through the year, I would suggest maybe we'd want to look at that at budget time.
Yeah, that should be a good time to think about it, because that'll be a few months off, and we'll have them, as Rod says, probably in the next 6 weeks or so, and have a pretty good idea by the time the budget cycle rolls around as to where we stand with it.
So I would say keep us posted. I think it's great.
Will do.
Any other questions or comments? Discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Mayor Satterthwaite?
Yes. Motion carries with 7 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-0-006. This refers to an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance, referring to the tree trimming grant. So moved.
Motion a second. Any discussion on this? There's no discussion. All those will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes?
Mayor Satterwhite?
Yes. Motion carries with 7 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-01-007, an ordinance annexing certain territory to the city of Urbana. This refers to approximately .138 acres located at 407 South Dodson, owned by the Homestead Corporation. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? There's no discussion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Yes. Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-01-008, an ordinance approving and authorizing the execution of an annexation agreement. This refers to 2413 and 2425 East Elm Street, and also to 504 MacArthur Drive, all of these owned by the Homestead Corporation of Champaign-Urbana. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion on this? If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Mayor Satterthwaite?
Yes. That motion carries with 7 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2005-01-009, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute a development agreement with Bear Properties LLC. So moved.
We have a motion and a second. I know Mr. Reggetz has a few changes. I didn't believe a new document was put on council members' desks. John, you want to go through those?
Certainly. We have some clarifications and some confirmations in the document. On page 3, of course, as you can see, we delineate the name of the company as a limited liability company rather than a corporation, and also make a clarification on their corporate structure. On page 6, we further identify the Tax Increment Allocation Redevelopment Act to identify, to further define what eligible redevelopment project costs are. On page 7, we clarify for developer what the caps on the eligible reimbursement is. And then a little further down, we adjust the date to reflect when the evaluation for the property will indeed take effect. On page 8, we simplify the statement referring to the time period for the evaluation of the reimbursable payment caps to the tax year, and leave any reference to benefits to previous section 3.2, and simplify that statement. And then at page 10, we basically confirm that the project, if it moves forward, is eligible for the provisions of the agreement. If it does not move forward, then there is no benefits accrued, and there is no obligation on either part of the party.
Any questions about any of those changes? Mr. Alex?
Just one, and that relates to the date. I note change from 2006 to 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Does that indicate that the development for this parcel isn't expected to commence until 2008?
No, sir. What that means is the completion of the project is December 31st, 2006, and so the EAV will not be adjusted till the following year, and therefore will not be payable till the year past that, which is 2008, and therefore the benefits, or actually the increased revenues, won't be available until then.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Motion would be in order to amend the agreement with recommended changes.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion on those? Not. All those in favor of that motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any back to the main motion. Any discussion on the motion approving the redevelopment agreement? Seeing none, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
The next meeting of the Committee of the Whole is scheduled for next week, Monday, January 24th, at 7:30 p.m. in the council chambers at 400 South Vine Street.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have reports of special committees. Any special committee reports this evening? Okay, then we'll go to reports of officers. Well, Mr. Gray's coming up to give a couple of reports. I want to inform council members and the public that there's an Urbana Business Association celebration tomorrow in Lincoln Square, in the Lincoln Square High Court at 5 o'clock to talk about the accomplishments of 2004. So if you're available, please join us. Mr. Gray.
Thank you. Wanted to talk about 2 items. I distributed 2 information memos and apologize for not getting those to you a little sooner, but just to overview, talk about recycling program costs first. Councilmember Pat raised some thoughts, concerns about a disproportionately higher cost for the multifamily apartment folks versus residential. And the memo basically outlines the fact that, first of all, how the 2 programs were established a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and with respect to how we did go out for bids, competitive bids, and receive those proposals and awarded contracts, respectively, 5-year contracts with 2 additional years that could be extended to make it a possible total year contract of 7 years. But as I think most of you know, the residential collection is provided by ABC, and the multifamily is collected by Central Waste. Anyway, the memo talks a little bit about the efficiencies or the transportation side of the collection of the materials for residential apartments, but I think the main point of this memo is just to talk about what are the real collection costs. And I'm excluding the other costs that are involved with the program, but the true collection costs. And if you look at those collection costs based on the number of dwelling units that we're serving in the residential and the multifamily side, the collection costs for a household is $1.90 per dwelling per month. And for an apartment dwelling unit, it's $1.94 per unit per month. So, and there's additional costs, such as what we approved tonight for the carts and et cetera. But we do charge both entities $2.50 per unit per month. And of course, dorms are a little less at $1.75. So I wanted just to clarify that even though the container may be different from an 18-gallon bin or the 65-gallon U-cart or the 95-gallon cart that we use for the apartments, and there's a different price for the collection depending on what the size of the container may be, the actual cost that a unit pays is almost identical. It's very close to each other. The apartment containers, the 95-gallon carts, probably service certainly more than 1 unit. We estimate, all things being equal, maybe 6 or 7 units or what have you. But to look at the per unit costs, though, they're pretty close. So we wanted to clarify this. We go into little details of just the efficiencies of collection or whatever that maybe have a little bit to do with cost difference. But at the end of the day, I think you'll see that those collection side costs are about the same. So I wanted to at least bring this up, and if there's questions or what have you, I could answer those later on.
And this again was through we determined those prices at $1.90 per dwelling in the single family and $1.94 in the apartments through the competitive bidding process. Is
correct?
That right?
Yes. Yeah. The second item then is the Vine and Elm Street situation. I did receive an email today from Councilmember Roberts, so I'm not prepared really to address those additional concerns. But from last Monday's meetings, I did receive a copy of the recent accident that occurred there. I'm familiar with that is we've further looked at the intersection. We immediately made a further adjustment, modification to the intersection by the installation of a stop and line sign that's there now, which we think would certainly help clarify and the motorist to stop at the stop bar. Stopping at the stop bar, you're still a 10-foot or so distance away from the southbound or west curb face, if you will, so there's still a decent distance with respect to how close you get to cross traffic. And secondly, when you stop at that stop bar, and I think this is for virtually all vehicles, you can see clearly to Main Street and beyond for those southbound vehicles. So we think with this additional information of a stop and line sign, we believe that it should be very clear for folks to see north and southbound traffic at the intersection. We will certainly continue to monitor the intersection. If there are issues, pedestrian crossing issues, vehicle accidents or what have you, and continue to study it from that perspective. But we feel with the revised stop bar location that was done a little over a month ago or so, and then this additional sign, we think it should be visibility should be clear.
Any questions? Yes, Mr. Roberts?
Well, of course, I was the person who had brought this up earlier, and I was pleased to know that Councilwoman Ryman was also concerned about the question. And I appreciate your efforts in trying to clarify what the situation is on this corner. I acknowledge that it's, certainly I've seen some steps that have changed the situation. I noticed that the stop bar line had been moved forward, and then within a day or two there was an additional sign below the stop sign asking motorists to please stop at the bar, which does indeed bring the car up to a place where you can see much farther north for oncoming traffic. Of course, then the thought that I had is that where does that leave the pedestrian? Because basically now that we've moved the stop bar forward, we've taken, we're having the car stop basically right on the far edge of the pedestrian, what would normally be a pedestrian crosswalk area. And this is a corner that is adjacent to the courthouse itself, and on every other corner there are marked crosswalks. And also this is true on all the main streets that surround Lincoln Square Village, as it's going to become. So we know that there will be pedestrian traffic at this corner. I mean, I pass this corner every day going to my bus. During the summer, we have the farmers market. When Lincoln Square becomes Lincoln Square Village, people will be living there and be using the crosswalk even more. So I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm just asking the logical questions. And I guess in terms of public safety, is that we've seen if a car has now been pulled up to the stop bar, but a pedestrian wishes to cross the street while traffic is flowing, where can they possibly walk? There really is no place to cross then. So I know that the bus routes come through that stop, and I know that the orange bus and the brown and others, gray, are using that intersection on a pretty regular basis. So I guess I have continued concerns about it, and I'm not sure what the great solution could be, but I think that before the brick sign is finalized or completed by having what I imagine is going to be some kind of metal plaque placed within the alcoved part of the structure, and which would make it even less likely to be changed in the future, that maybe we need to think about what is our final solution for this sign sooner rather than later. So in my memo to you today, I included the comments of 3 different people who had been in touch with me in the last week concerning the development of this corner. And I had asked Chief Adair if he would, as the Chief Police Officer of the city, to make some kind of thoughtful comment on the safety of the corridor in light of traffic and pedestrian use. I didn't really expect an answer tonight because I thought it might take a few days to talk about in staff or something. So I'm quite willing to have it put on the agenda for the committee of the whole or however. But and I'm not trying to be difficult, but I just kind of have this still. There's something there that's not right, and it bothers me. And it's just me, I guess. And maybe if the police chief could tell me that actually there is nothing to worry about, I would accept his opinion. But I'm just acting as an advocate for my neighborhood.
Any other comments or questions, and knowing that this will be on the agenda for next week? Ms. Pat?
Well, just briefly, I'm concerned about it too, so and I'll save my detailed comments for next week, but you're not alone in this concern.
Ms. Wyman?
I want to just add, obviously, Mr. Roberts isn't the only one, because there are several people who have, not only the people who Mr. Roberts included in this email, some of his neighbors and constituents, but I think one of the reasons it was brought up to the and discussed at the County Board Facilities Committee meeting, I believe on January 4th, was because several constituents of the county board members, or of at least one county board member, had contacted their county board member regarding this issue. So one request I have to Mr. Gray, just before we address this more fully at the next committee meeting, is that if you could contact Mr. Inman or whoever is responsible regarding facilities, and suggest that if there are plans to make final changes or additional changes to the as in putting in more lettering at this brick structure on Vine and Elm, that if you could ask them to delay that until after we've been able to discuss it, in case we ask or try to enter into some negotiation about doing something with that structure, so it doesn't end up costing whoever ends up paying for it more money. Thank you.
Mr. Alex?
Again, don't want to belabor this because I know we'll talk about it next week. One thing that might be useful for the discussion next week is if you or one of your staff could put together a sketch of the intersection. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but I'd like to see the substantiation of the notion that our visibility triangle is being satisfied and that the visibility triangle is sufficient. Purely out of ignorance, my own unfamiliarity with the ordinance, I'd like to understand how that interacts with what's actually out there on the street. Personally, I drive through that intersection every day on the way to and from work, and the irony is not lost on me that we worked rather well with the county to remove the building that was at the northwest corner of Main and Vine, which represented a long-standing traffic hazard for people trying to turn southbound, and promptly relocated that one block to the south, where again we have a situation where we have to have the stop line, so close to the southbound street that there's effectively no provision for pedestrian crossing there. And I think, dealing with a situation where we've got older buildings that were built before streets were widened and so forth is one thing, but a situation where we've got, new streets, newly streetscaped, and a new development by a public agency, which, as far as I'm concerned, is creating an active traffic hazard, I think is something that we ought to be able to look at. So you are certainly not alone. And to the extent that we could have some documentation or something that might help us understand the situation or be able to make a recommendation, I think that'd be appreciated.
Gentlemen?
To help facilitate next week's discussion about this, I have a question I'll just present now, and which is, when do we determine when or when not to have pedestrian crosswalks or pedestrian walkways? Because it was unusual to me to think that we have the option of removing a pedestrian crossway. I didn't know that that was an option. So I'd like some clarification that I think would help educate council members generally about must we provide them? If we don't provide them, what are the consequences, things like that.
Any other questions or comments that would help facilitate the discussion next week? Okay. Yes, Ms. Wyman?
I was going to request from the county board, from the clerk, a copy of the facilities committee tape, and I'll try and listen to that before the hopefully before packets go out, so I can put a memo in there if there's anything relevant. I mean, the concerns, I think, are not only safety, but the additional concern that I brought up at the last meeting was the liability issue. And if that issue is, if I was mistaken in understanding that the county felt that the city would be completely liable, and then that's one thing. But I want to make sure, one, that we aren't causing or creating a hazard issue, and the other thing is that we aren't causing any liability for the city in whether we take action or fail to take action on this.
Mr. Holtz, I know that you followed up on that with some of the county attorneys. Give us a little update.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to review the tape myself personally, but I did speak with one of the assistant state's attorneys in the civil division. He told me that there were some comments there from one of the county board members raising essentially the same kinds of concerns that Mr. Roberts and the rest of you have been raising about safety at the intersection. I was told, again, this is not verified by myself reviewing the tape personally, I was told that there were no comments to the effect that the city or the county or one or the other or both would be liable in the case of an accident. But certainly it's worth looking into, and it appears that there's a number of people who are struck by what seems to be an unsafe change at the intersection, so we ought to explore it, and I'm perfectly happy to work on that.
Okay, any other comments? Well, we'll see that on next week's agenda then, and talk about that in more detail at that time. Any other reports of officers? Okay, we'll go on to new business. We have a few items this evening. First is an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement with Illinois American Water Company concerning the use of public ways of the city, fire protection, and other related matters. Mr. Holtz?
Yes, and we have 3 representatives of the water company here tonight. I'll ask them to have a seat up there. We'll get some extra chairs. If you don't mind introducing yourselves to the City Council.
Hi, Mr. Mayor and the council members. I'm Sue Schultz. I'm the attorney for the water company on this matter. And with me I have Fred Ruckman, who is the Illinois network manager, the general manager for the state. And to Fred's right is Brent O'Neill, who is the Champaign network manager.
So, at long last we're here. We finally got an agreement to propose to you. This being an unusual meeting night for us because of the holiday yesterday, Tuesday night. It so happens that the city of Champaign considered this already this same evening, and so part of the context of this meeting that we have here is that, as I understand from what Sue Schultz told me right before this meeting started, they had just arrived over here from across Wright Street, and that the city of Champaign has reviewed and considered the agreement and has approved their, I think, a city manager signing off on the agreement, basically as proposed here. I'd like to give you just a real brief overview of what we have here. It's it's fairly lengthy, although not quite as lengthy as it might seem because we've got it double spaced, whereas the original was single spaced. Makes for easier reading and understanding. The context of this thing, again, is that we're looking at basically a monopoly type of utility. It's monopoly by nature. There is no point in having 2 separate companies providing water service to the same residents because you just have parallel set of lines with parallel water pumping and everything else. It'd be a complete waste of extra infrastructure. And yet, it's important to have something that defines the obligations and the relationship of the parties here, the parties being the city as it represents the citizens of the city, and the water company itself, and how it goes about providing service. we've just now finished and had expire a 15-year predecessor agreement that was negotiated in 1989, expired on December 31 of this past year, after we gave a couple of extensions on it so that we could continue the negotiations. We have been in negotiations on this particular agreement for about a year and a half. We started in June 2003, met by and large every other week, and towards the end every week, and then towards the very end seemed like every 20 minutes by phone or email to get this thing wrapped up. I guess as part of the context that we should consider in looking at this, we should bear in mind that as I said in my cover memo, this thing has been colored to some extent by our experience with another utility, that being Illinois Power, and the way it was run by its parent corporation, Dynegy, out of Texas, before it was recently taken over by Ameren and is now run as Ameren IP. Our experience with Illinois Power, as you all know, was not a good thing. Things declined over the long term, and money that was budgeted, for instance, for infrastructure types of improvements, was never spent. There was a sense that the parent corporation was basically sucking capital out of the local Illinois Power Company, and our sense from that, combined with the fact that the local water company had been purchased and repurchased a couple of times over the last several years, led us to fear much the same kind of thing could be happening or could happen in the future with the water company unless we have adequate protections. At least one prior meeting, and I think actually probably 2 or 3 prior meetings, the city council members had expressed publicly the desire that we negotiate or seek to obtain an option to purchase the company as part of this agreement. That would be basically a provision in the agreement that would give the city the ability to communicate to the water company that for whatever reason we would choose to purchase the company, basically by a condemnation action, a right of eminent domain that would allow a city to take private property for public purposes with, of course, adequate compensation, just compensation as required by the Constitution, to them for purchase of that. That goal has not been realized in these negotiations. We recognize that it was a pretty lofty goal, and we were never sure whether or not we would get it. Certainly the water company had been clear from the very first that this was not something that they would agree to, but we tried anyways. We recognized as well that there were a couple of things that an option to purchase would give us, and really most significantly, I think, is the sense that an option to purchase is the ultimate control that the local government, the city of Urbana, would have over the water company to make sure that we were satisfied with how it's run, what its rates are, how well it protects the citizens in expenditures, in keeping up its infrastructure and keeping the water safe, all those kinds of things. Because if the company doesn't do those things well enough, then theoretically at least the city could exercise its option and proceed towards an eminent domain proceeding and and run the water system itself, much like the city runs various other public infrastructure needs of the citizens of Urbana. In the absence of an option to purchase, we asked ourselves, and that is Fred Stavens and I, the negotiators that represented the cities, we asked ourselves what would give the cities adequate protection, at least reasonably adequate protection against those kinds of concerns. And what it came down to in our minds was a couple of things. One is adequate protections in terms of real performance requirements on the company in the language of the agreement itself. The agreement that just recently expired had some language, but really not much detail, and it was kind of more general and really didn't seem to kind of get at the meat of things. And I think the basic understanding of the predecessor agreement was that, well, the company is regulated by the Illinois Commerce Commission as well as by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, and that those entities would do the job in protecting the citizens. Excuse me. What we sought was to add to and supplement the regulatory jurisdiction of those entities. In addition, we felt that probably the other single and perhaps the single most difficult obstacle for us to ensure that the water company is performing properly is an agreement that is too long in duration. The agreement that just expired was 15 years. The Illinois Power Agreement that we're still in the middle of is a 50-year agreement, and we're in year 35 of that agreement, so there's still 15 years left on that. Obviously, if you're stuck in a contract that lasts as long as that and the situation changes, you've got to wait it out. And by then, all kinds of things can happen. And so what we concluded we needed to do, and what the water company has agreed to do in the context of this proposal, is to have a really quite short term of the agreement. The agreement would run for 2 years from January 4 of this year, and retroactively a little bit obviously, through January 4th of 2007, and then from that point on renew automatically every 2 years for subsequent 2-year periods. 6 months before each renewal period, that is 6 months before the end of each 2-year term, the city or the company, either one, could give a notice of decision to not renew and request to sit back down and negotiate the entire agreement or some or other little provision of it or major provisions. The advantage of this for us is that if the water company's performance should decline over the period of time, then we can always come right back and say, no, we need something better than this. Sit down with us, please, and talk to us about it, and let's figure this out. It gives us also the ability to monitor the regulatory environment, monitor the environment of any kind of water laws that the state of Illinois might pass, obviously monitor the performance of the company itself, and also to allow subsequent city councils to look at not just tweaking the ordinance, or tweaking the agreement with the company, but also to allow us to evaluate as we choose whether or not some kind of an eminent domain action might be appropriate. There is nothing, as a side note, there's nothing in this current agreement that restricts our ability to move forward with any kind of an eminent domain proceeding if we so wanted to. It's just that we don't have a right to purchase the company. We would have to, under existing Illinois law, go and get some kind of approval first from the Illinois Commerce Commission, and then through the court system proceed with with the condemnation, just like any other eminent domain proceeding would occur. So that's the basic context in which this thing was done. Now, in lieu of the option to purchase, then let me just kind of run down a list here of some of the key protections that we believe we've gotten in this agreement. We've gotten increased customer service protections, basically requirements on the company to do everything from answer the phone within a certain amount of time to having live people answering the phones to responding to billing requests and hookup requests and things like that within certain periods of time. Water emergencies language. This language really grew directly out of the Boyle order that came about, I think it was the Thanksgiving before last, when I think everybody realized, both the city governments as well as the water company officials themselves, that we really had lousy communication between city officials and water company officials for dealing in a very effective way for this kind of situation. And so the agreement spells out various kinds of notice requirements, immediate telephone notice, immediate accessibility to one another of city officials, who are in decision-making position and company officials who are in decision-making positions in case of water emergencies, as well as the establishment of a community water emergency task force. That task force would be comprised of basically public safety and other appropriate officials for the city, a couple of appropriate officials for the company, and would also be in conjunction with any other local community, particularly the city of Champaign, that wanted to participate in it. We have audit language now in the franchise agreement, in the proposed agreement, which we didn't have before. Basically, that would require every other 2-year term, that is basically every 4 years, would require or allow the city, in conjunction with the city of Champaign, to have an outside independent expert evaluate the infrastructure and systems of the water company. And this would be at a 50-50 cost share between the cities and the water company, up to $10,000 for the water company. Likewise, there's insurance requirements in there now, security requirements, a letter of credit required as performance guarantee, language addressing what should happen if the company were to default in its agreement. And then, as I mentioned before, this 2-year term, renewable in 2-year increments. And then lastly, the company offered, and we agreed to, a right of first refusal. I'd like to take a second to contrast for you a right of first refusal and an option to purchase. An option to purchase basically is something that would be triggered in normal circumstances by the purchaser, that is the city. A right of first refusal instead is something that's triggered by action of the company, the seller. A right of first refusal is something that kicks in when the company basically offers for sale its facilities to somebody else. Upon that trigger, then, under this language, the city would have an option to say, I won't use the word option, I know that causes heartache over there at the other side of the table, would have the ability to say that the city then wants to purchase the system. Now, while it sounds pretty good, I personally don't feel that it's a particularly good right of first refusal in this context, because it gets triggered only in a very limited circumstance. The Illinois American Water Company is part of is owned several chains up ultimately by an international conglomerate headed out of Essen, Germany, and we are ultimately part of the Americas, not North America or not the United States, but ultimately part of the Americas, which kind of gives you a sense of, in terms of how that company views our system, which gives you a sense of really kind of how tiny we really are to them. And I know the people here at the table here, all of whom are nice people, I've dealt with them before, will tell us, probably, I'm sure in good faith, that the company has the best intentions with respect to this system here, but these people might not be the people that we're talking to in a half a year or a year down the road. What limits this right of first refusal in this context is that it kicks in really only if the company decides to carve out this little section of its massive system and sell this little section. If this sale is instead as part of the overall sale of Illinois American Water or of all RWE's assets in the United States, then this right of first refusal would not kick in. So even though our system could get sold to somebody else, this right of first refusal would give us nothing at all. So having said that, I'll open this up to questions from all of you, and the company representatives here have indicated a willingness and desire to answer questions as well.
Do you folks have any comment before we take questions?
We just wanted to extend our thanks to both to you, Mayor Sathway, and the council, as well as to Steve for his diligence in putting this agreement together. Steve has gone through and explained this. There's been some checks and balances that have been put in this agreement that weren't there before. But even with the past agreement and now, we look forward to serving the community as we have for the last 115 years.
Okay. Any questions, Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes, where is Alton? I don't know what state Alton is in.
Alton is in Illinois. It's this side of the Mississippi River, probably 20 minutes north of Interstate 70 going into St. Louis.
And is that where our local customer services will be run out of or is run out of?
Local customer service in the field is still run out of Champaign. Brent O'Neill is the local contact for anyone who wants to speak to someone locally. If a person picks up the phone and dials the 800 number that's on the bill, it will go to Alton, Illinois. Yes.
Okay. I have two questions for the city, I guess for Steve. One is, in looking at this, well, actually I should ask my one question. What does purchasing mean? When we say option to purchase, what does purchasing mean? Do we own the right of way, obviously. The people of Urbana own the right of way. Are the pipes owned by the water company and the point of source, the land where they drill into the water, is that also owned by the water company? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
The city owns the rights of way in which most, but not all, of the water facilities are located. And by that I mean not the storage tanks and things like that, but the pipes themselves, the mains, the hydrants and things like that. Those pipes are owned. They are property of the water company, not of the city, even though they're in the city right of way. This is much like with other utilities and other entities that provide utility-like services, including obviously the power company, cable company, things like that. And maybe Sue can embellish, or Fred or Brent embellish on this a little bit. But basically, the water company has certain facilities that it owns privately, property where it has its storage tanks, property where it does runs its well operations and water treatment operations, and those wells and the facilities of the company are owned by the company basically as property. So getting back to what seems to be the substance of your question, the core of your question, which is what does purchase mean? It would mean purchase of the water company's facilities that the water company owns. So whether or not they're on private property or on public right-of-way, those facilities are what would be purchased.
So when we're negotiating, the water company needs the city of Urbana to use its right-of-way to pipe the water through. And the city of Urbana, if it refuses that right-of-way, really the only option to provide water to constituents is to build our own infrastructure, for example, or to purchase. But if it's not for sale, then purchasing is not an issue. Is that correct?
Yes. The city could build a parallel system if it so desired, or could find somebody else to build a parallel system. Again, the economics of that are terrible at best. But there does always remain the possibility, although the statutes and regulations are not really conducive to it, of a condemnation that is an eminent domain proceeding by which the company could purchase the system, despite the, did I say the company? By which the city could purchase the system despite the company's lack of a desire to sell it.
Mm-hmm. And in an eminent domain situation, not to get into the details, but the city would have to prove to the state commission that there are some hardships that we're experiencing, or is the bar not that high?
The bar is not that high, but it is different from a typical eminent domain proceeding. In a typical eminent domain proceeding, where we're just talking about a tract of land somewhere, say we needed to build a new fire substation somewhere, and we didn't own any property there, the city could identify an appropriate parcel of land and start eminent domain proceedings, and basically we've got the right and the authority as a government to do that. And the only questions for a court would be really two questions. One is, would this be for a public purpose, because we can take private property only for public purposes? And number two, if so, what's the property worth, and how much does the city own that private property owner from whom the city is taking this property? So those two questions. In the context of condemnation of a water system, there is an additional hurdle, and that is that the statutes require the Illinois Commerce Commission to give approval of a condemnation action before the city can even proceed to the normal steps of taking it to court and making a determination of those two factors, public purpose and price. So, and that's, Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the Pekin situation, right?
That is correct. The test
and
before the commission is the better public interest would be served. Sorry, the test before the Illinois Commerce Commission, it would have to be established that it was in the better public interest for the city to acquire the system.
Okay. Two more questions. One is, if my memory serves me, I believe when I moved here it was Illinois Water, and it became Illinois American Water, and then it's been sold since. So there's been at least 3 owners since 1995 that I remember. And I distinctly remember my water prices going up by 10% each time it was bought by another company, by the way. I'm trying to remember if it has ever been on the market, or if it's just been the case that the current owners have kind of merged with other owners. Has ever been an option in the last 20 years for the city of Urbana to purchase the infrastructure? Has it been on the market in that way?
Not basically on the open market as an entity that the city could purchase. Maybe Sue or Fred, Brent, can you kind of address that question?
No, it has not been on the open market. I've been with the company since 1972, lived in Champaign-Urbana for up until 2000. Worked for the former Northern Illinois Water Corporation until it was acquired by American Water Works in 1999. Transferred to Belleville, Illinois in 2000. Illinois American Water was the purchaser of Northern Illinois Water. We're still Illinois American Water, even though the parent company assets, the parent company stock, was purchased by another investor. So, and to speak to your comment about the water rates going up about 10% every time it was purchased, I would simply say that the practice of the former Northern Illinois Water and of Illinois American Water has been to adjust rates every 2 to 3 years. So I think it's simply coincidental that it would appear to be related to the acquisition. I know the former Northern Illinois Water had a rate increase in the first of 1998, I think December 97, January 98. We had another rate increase in 2001, I believe it was, and then another one in August of 2003. It's prudent, we believe, to adjust rates periodically rather than wait 5-10 years and then have a very large rate increase, so we choose to do it more frequently in smaller increments.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. My final question is, as council members, well, speak for myself, as a council member, I think it's difficult because I don't know what I'm comparing. I don't know what's really on the table. Have we done a cost-benefit analysis of pursuing municipal ownership versus continuing with private ownership for our constituents to look at cost, service, responsiveness, et cetera? And I guess, you know, the concerns that you've negotiated around with this are exactly the concerns that I think are our concerns. That has to do with if we don't provide, if someone doesn't like the monument that was put up on Vine and Elm Street because it blocks visibility, they can come here every Monday at 7:30 and we can hear about it until there's a response. So with the city, it's obvious there's an immediate responsiveness. I think if we look across different cities, there's definitely a cost, there's definitely benefit in terms of cost. There is a big upfront cost, et cetera. So I just wonder if, when looking at this, I don't know how I can act in the public interest if I don't see, if the benefit is largely equal, then I think the status quo makes a lot of sense, because changing the status quo is a lot of effort. But if the benefit is vastly different from one another, if the private benefit is much less of a benefit to the public than public ownership, and we can quantify what that difference is, then we know what it is that we're choosing between, so to speak. So my question to you, Steve, is whether or not, in looking at this, we actually have some sense of a cost-benefit analysis of pursuing the Pekin model versus pursuing the status quo and tightening up the language to protect, worst-case scenarios, which I think you certainly have done a good job at with this agreement.
Thank you. I think that what we need to bear in mind is that, again, this agreement doesn't change anything about the environment as it existed before in terms of whether or not we have the ability to exercise some kind of an eminent domain or condemnation action of these facilities. What it does is establish and memorialize the as you put it, the status quo, actually an enhanced status quo, but certainly continues on the existing relationship between the city and the company without any dramatic fundamental change, such as the company being sold to the city. There has not been a separate sort of cost-benefit analysis or any other type of analysis as to whether or not the city should move forward with a condemnation action, whether or not it would provide better service, or whether it would provide lower rates. There hasn't been anything like that. To do so would require, at the very minimum, a substantial appropriation of funds to perform that analysis. It's highly technical, involves all kinds of things about which we don't have any expertise. But that can be done at any time that the council deems it to be appropriate. If you review the literature about these kinds of systems, you will find all different kinds of points of view. The ones that I personally often find most persuasive are those showing that municipal-owned water systems tend to have lower rates and provide basically as good a service as privately owned water systems. In fact, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that 85% of the water systems in the country are municipal-owned, not privately owned. So if things are lousy under municipal ownership, they're lousy all over the country, and that apparently is not the case. Having said that, however, there is a difference between municipal ownership that starts off as municipal ownership when the system gets built in the first place, and municipal ownership in terms of a condemnation that gets done against the will of the company. Because in order for a condemnation to proceed, you're going to incur a tremendous amount of costs that have really nothing at all to do with the water system itself in the fight. Tremendous PR costs, long-term litigation, long-term attorney fees, expert witnesses, expert analysts, and I don't recall off the top of my head the kind of money that Pekin has spent, the city of Pekin has spent in trying to move forward with its condemnation. And at this point, so far, Pekin has been denied the ability to condemn. The Illinois Commerce Commission ruled against the city of Pekin. That's on appeal. Pekin's challenging the Commerce Commission's bases for making that decision. Nevertheless, the fact is that Pekin has spent a tremendous amount of money trying to make that happen. you'd like to think that, well, if the water company was just going to be nice about it and just, let us do the condemnation without fighting it, well, then we wouldn't expend so much in cost. But, that's a decision for the private owners of the company to make, and I guess they'll act in their best interest as they see fit. So, an analysis like that could be done. There isn't anything about moving forward with this agreement that would preclude that. And in fact, I think in the meantime, it would still be very beneficial to the city to go forward with this agreement, particularly since it has a short term, 2 years renewable.
Thank you. That background's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or questions? Ms. Wyman?
Just have, I think, one brief question, hopefully brief. One of the benefits you mentioned in your memo is that there's now, or in this proposed agreement, a certain level of performance that's mandated. And certainly that's attractive, but I'm wondering what the process is or the penalty for a violation of this, and if you can also provide an example or two of certainly what this level of performance would be.
Well, let's go to the precise section that deals with that so we can kind of follow along. Sue, do you remember off the top of your head what the citation is in the agreement on that?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
If you'll bear with me for a moment here. How about 8.1 and 8.2?
You said 8.1?
I think that's where we would be. Let me double check here. Yeah. So, if you'll have a look at sections 8.1 and 8.2, you'll see that there's a process set forth in there that essentially gives the city the right to terminate the agreement and or to levy basically administrative penalties against the company. There might be another section as well, so I'll have to double check, but it's primarily in 8.1 and 8.2.
The relocation section has its own.
The relocation section has its own, thank you, and that would be what, 2.2, I think?
2 point something.
Ultimately, when you get down to the question of what kinds of enforcement the city can take, you wind up back with this, from our perspective, the very uncomfortable situation that there is only one water company, and it makes sense to have only one water company, and it's not like with some non-essential service. Where theoretically you could shut it down, when you regulate a bar or something, if they're messing up and selling to kids or whatever, you can shut them down for a weekend or a week or revoke their license for a month. Well, you can't do that with the water company. Really, what you have here is an enforcement mechanism that although theoretically has the ability to terminate, leaves you back with the question of what does the termination of an agreement mean. And essentially what it means is we can force them back to the table and say, look, in order to do this, in order to comply with this agreement, you've got to, in order to operate in the city, you've got to meet with us and deal with these problems. We do also have the ability, as does the water company, to take the water company, to take the other side to court to seek equitable remedies, basically ask a court to order that the company has to perform to X and X standard. Those kinds of remedies are available under the language of the agreement. What exactly the proper forum would be would, I suppose, depend on the nature of the kind of right we're trying to enforce, whether it would be before a court or the ICC or something. But we would have that. In the absence of an extreme measure like that, the agreement basically calls on the city to give notice to the company that it's in violation of the agreement. Certain time frames kick in, 10 days notice, response times, things like that. But ultimately with the ability of the city, if it feels that the company has violated the agreement and has failed to clean up those violations, the ability of the city to impose administrative sanctions. They're relatively small, $100 up to a maximum of $5,000 per incident or per year. The reason that they're low at that level is that I'm convinced that if we were at a situation where we thought it was worthwhile enough to go through this whole process of notices of violations and of seeking remedies, we would almost certainly choose some, for anything that was really significant, we would choose some other method under law or equity in court, seeking orders and appropriate restraints from the Commerce Commission or some entity like that to get the company to comply with the agreement. So I think as a practical matter, the most powerful aspect of these things is, besides the language just giving everybody the right to take the other to court if the compliance is not, if there's not compliance with the agreement, and second, that we've got the ability to invoke this process that basically forces people to come in and answer to what the problems are and to address them on a time frame that we feel is appropriate. In the context of specifically relocations of water facilities, which are under Section 2.2 of the agreement, we have, and actually not just relocations, but also restoration of rights-of-way. So if the company in doing some of its work damages public property or damages private property in order to do its work, we have enforcement mechanisms that basically allow us self-help. That is, if a water main needs to be relocated as part of a city project, and if we've given proper notice to the company that it needs to be done, and the company doesn't do it within an appropriate time frame, we can cause it to be done ourselves and bill it to the water company. So that's the kind of performance guarantee that we don't have under the current agreement. Likewise, for restoration of the rights-of-way. If the company tears up a city street, doesn't promptly repair it, or tears up somebody's front yard, doesn't properly or promptly repair it, then the city can come back and get that done and, again, bill the water company. So basically that comes down to self-help and allows the city to take care of matters like that. Does that answer your questions?
I should have been more clear, I guess. Regarding the performance or what would be a violation, I guess one example I could give, and maybe you could respond to this, is the incident that you mentioned earlier that happened 2 Thanksgivings ago, where there was a problem with the water issue. It appears under here on page 44 under 8.2a, or 8.2a, that as long as there was action taken within 7 days, then there wouldn't be a problem. And I'm just wondering, usually with water concerns, these issues need to be addressed in much less than 7 days.
Yeah. Let's look at, instead of 8.2 for that particular question, let's look at section 4.4? Is that right, Sue?
That's in 4, definitely.
Double check here. 4.5, water emergencies.
Yes.
If you look at the language under water emergencies, basically what is committed to by both the company and the city is an ongoing process that requires mutually the ability to contact each other in an emergency, essentially upon a moment's notice. Now, if we know of an emergency now, we have to be able to contact the company, appropriate representatives of the company now. Likewise for them. In terms of enforcement of that, I think the situation really is different there than it would be in another situation. Obviously, any kind of time frames that you might have for dealing with an emergency, saying, well, you got 7 days to take care of an emergency, that's not going to be helpful at all. And you're making a good point there. I think that what we have here is a mutual commitment by the company and the city, if this is accepted, to work together on a regular and proactive basis to deal with these kinds of things. And if you'll look at specifically the language here at 4.5a, you'll see that starting in the 4th line of 4.5a, that the tasks of this task force are to develop comprehensive and effective community and company responses to water emergencies, number one. Number two, to analyze the causes and effects of water emergencies. And number three, for making recommendations for reducing or preventing future water emergencies. Now, and then if you go down to B, you'll see that there's those immediate notice requirements and things like that. It's the nature of an emergency that you can't have adequate enforcement of a failure to respond properly within any kind of a time that makes sense. If you need immediate response and you don't get it, well, then somebody is messed up, and you need to be able to haul people back and get them to fix their procedures and to work together with you on making sure that it doesn't happen again. I don't think that there's specific provision for particular fines for a failure of the company to respond immediately to a water emergency. My sense is that from the company as well as the city officials, that it's a kind of a mutually recognized, desirable, and in fact really mandatory obligation that we all owe to the citizens of Urbana. If there's a water emergency today, and if the company were to fail to respond appropriately, for instance, by delaying or not letting the right people know that there's a boil order or something like that, yeah, we would go through that process under Section 8.2 to let the company know that they haven't performed under the agreement, they need to fix the process and things like that. Obviously, the emergency's already passed by that point, and there's just nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, if the company fails to cooperate, we could either take them to court to get them to comply with the agreement, or impose the administrative sanctions. But there's no way to undo what's happened in an emergency.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Roberts.
Just a quick one. I noticed that it said that while the company has a kind of a range of limitations of 50 miles for the sale of water outside, without the consent of the council, it is important to bear in mind here, it says on 4.3 that current Illinois law does not limit others from tapping into the Mahomet Teas aquifer for the purposes of bottling or otherwise exporting water. I lived in Tucson. Tucson, there's not much water in the desert, but the city of Tucson owned its own wells. It had about 27 wells, and it had excellent drinking water, and it never failed the city. Now, they probably were pretty deep wells, but they existed. And I think it's so ironic that here's a place where all you need to do is get a spade and dig a 1-foot hole, and you'll have water. You have water in your basement, sometimes, a foot every winter or spring. And first of all, the founding fathers didn't just do their own water system, because the water was laying there. But okay, we don't own the wells, we don't own the pipes, and we're paying for it through the nose ever since. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is not for you, Steve, but it's just to us. What would stop? Is there a plan or a thought of the city ever initiating its own wells now, and maybe just to serve certain kinds of instances like hydrants or new construction in new areas, expansion? Because I'm sure it wouldn't take too hard for a well witcher to come out and find a location you could find water within a fair amount of distance below the surface. So I'm just wondering if there might be, we have this situation where it seems to me you've drawn up a fine solution to a two-year solution to this problem. But in this area where water is so abundant you have trouble getting rid of it, why doesn't the city think about initiating some kind of like a new program to become self-sufficient in the water industry, and start considering digging a few wells on its own property or property that it would purchase, in convenient locations where expansion would allow it to lay the pipes, its own pipes, in the future. And I don't know, that's just my comment, and maybe eventually there'll be a time when we can start buying pieces back. I don't know if this is possible. If we maybe the next time we draw up this agreement, maybe we can have a clause that says that we wish to buy pieces of the piping back or something at a discount, or we can condemn pipes or something in all neighborhoods. But otherwise, for tonight's to end this part of the conversation, I'm going to shut up and just say that I thought you did a pretty good job of at least adding some securities to the city for certain conditions which are more like tiny amenities or hors d'oeuvres on the plate of water service rather than a main course item.
Well, you're anybody who comes from the arid west of this country is going to be surprised by the lack of water laws in Illinois and some other Midwestern states where water really is plentiful. Western states have a lot of laws about water because water is scarce and everybody's fighting over it. And people over there will draw guns about whether or not they can open the pipe into their little irrigation ditch on their property. And there's the battles get heated and pitched, and we're lucky that we don't have those kinds of problems. That doesn't mean that our situation will remain this way forever, and I'm guessing that somewhere in the next few decades, Illinois will start putting in place some laws that more comprehensively deal with the issue of who can take water out of the ground under what circumstances and where they can use it or sell it.
Would we be in violation of our agreement with this water company if we did indeed try to have our own water source?
No, there is nothing in this agreement that would prevent us from doing that.
Well, I think it's a thought for the future, not tonight.
Yeah. Again, as Steve was saying, when we do, if we do anything of that nature, trying to get into the water business ourselves through condemnation of the existing water company or starting to do it ourselves, there's a long process of getting analysts in here. How much is it going to cost? How are we going to ramp up so that we can provide this service? As Steve rightly says, nothing in this agreement prevents us from doing that. We still have all those options open to us. But when we do that, we need to go in with our eyes open and recognizing, what the initial costs are going to be and what the long-term paybacks are going to be and so forth. I think we all agree that probably the best system for water in a municipality's eyes is to have it to be a municipal utility, and that's the way, as Steve mentioned earlier, that 80-85% of the country is right now. And but given the fact that we do have an existing water company, and they're not just going to turn it over to us on a contract sale over the next 20-year period.
Could they do it as a favor, do you think? Kind of a pro bono, act of national gesture of goodwill.
Sweet Corn Festival.
Yeah. Well, we'll go over to Germany and ask them about that. So, but yeah, those are all possibilities, but they need to be thoroughly researched before we jump in, and because we need to have all that information to make an intelligent decision. Any other questions or comments, Mr. Alex?
I had a few questions, and I don't know which one of you would be best to address them, so I'll just throw them out and let whoever wants to field them. First relates to the issue of rates has come up, and sort of how that interacts with the company being acquired by larger and larger companies. And I was curious to know, to what extent are the rates in this area determined by the cost of supplying water and maintaining the infrastructure in this area versus other areas? In other words, is the system here run in effect as a separate business unit so that we have the assurance that if there are infrastructure needs here, our rates are going to maintain those as opposed to going to maintain maybe deal with deferred maintenance issues in other areas of the system that have since been acquired? To what extent is it our usage and our infrastructure needs that affects our rates?
I can address that. The rates in Urbana-Champaign are based on the Urbana-Champaign business unit. There are other communities in Illinois where the rates are consolidated, so to speak. For example, our Belleville Alton, Granite City, Cairo, even Peoria rates are what we call single tariff pricing. Basically, the rates are the same in all of those communities. There's pluses and minuses to that. The plus being if you are a community that has a large infrastructure need, then the costs of that infrastructure are spread over a larger customer base. Downside is if you are a community in which the cost of service is otherwise low, then you might be adversely impacted by that. But over time, the proponents of that kind of pricing would say over time it all levels out. Every community ultimately has its own needs. But here in Urbana-Champaign, the rates are based on the cost of service here in Urbana-Champaign. Our rates were last adjusted in August of '03. I believe a typical customer in this community probably pays in the order of $20 to $25 a month for water service. $22? I'm sorry, bi-monthly. No, can't be. $22 bi-monthly. Think about what you pay for a bottle of water, assuming you buy bottled water, as many people do anymore. People don't hesitate to pay more than $1 for a bottle of water. We're delivering 6,000 gallons for a typical residential customer a month for less than what you would pay for a bottle of water a day. That water meets all IEPA quality standards. It is softened. The byproduct of that softening process is spread on farmers' fields. Very environmentally effective way to deal with that. Champaign-Urbana is one of the few communities in the state of Illinois to have softened water. Our ISO rating in Urbana is the highest it can possibly be. Very few for the water portion of that rating. Very few communities in the state of Illinois that can say that. I'm sure the fire chief could speak to that. Frankly, we're quite proud of the water system in Champaign-Urbana. I think there's a lot of fear because of the change in ownership. The 2-year agreement, I think, reflects that fear. It puts it back in the company to say, prove it, that nothing's going to change. Brent and I take that very seriously. There's nobody sitting in this room that's more interested in maintaining the kind of quality water service that this community's had than Brent and I.
Well, I think the basis for the question, you understand why I'm asking the question, is that, who ultimately owns the system or reaps the profit from the system is not as consequential, I don't think, to the customers here as the extent to which the money that's being spent on water here is actually going to pump the water, maintain the infrastructure, pay for the staff who's working here and doing the work. And I think if it seems like there's a great degree of sensitivity about these larger and larger companies becoming involved, I think that stems from things like the Dynegy issue where, there was definitely a feeling that there was a maintenance being deferred on the electrical plant to the point that it was becoming a safety issue or an economic issue, and that the rates that were being paid were in effect going to subsidize improvements in other territories but not here. And I think the fact that you can, to the extent that you can make the commitment that this is a separate business unit, I think that would address a lot of the discomfort that people may be feeling over the feeling like you're going to call a water company and get somebody speaking German.
It's interesting that in our last rate case, the Citizens Utilities Board intervened in that rate case and was a proponent of all of our customers paying the same rates in the state of Illinois. And we as a company fought that vigorously for the customers in Urbana, Champaign, Pekin, other areas of the state where the rates are based on that business unit. That is our position currently. I think that'll be our long-term position. If the city of Urbana came to us and said we no longer support that, we would like to see us put in the pot, so to speak, with everybody else. we would certainly entertain that. But that's a very sensitive issue to us and to our customers.
A couple other questions. On page 22 in section 4.1B1, it's about halfway down the page on the right side of page 22. There's a statement I didn't understand related to emergency contacts. The sentence reads, "The numbers provided shall be for, at minimum, the highest-ranking company representative and operational official with the authority to make emergency system decisions for the system serving the city." Is that not intended to read the lowest-ranking company representative? I would think the highest ranking would be the CEO of the company, which I assume was not the intent.
Well, I believe the intent was the highest ranking in the community, which would be Brent in this instance.
Do you understand my confusion?
I understand it the same way that Ms. Schultz reads it. I'm not sure. It certainly would.
I mean, when we say at a minimum, we want the number of the highest ranking. I mean, how could we get more? How could that be anything but? How could we go above that minimum?
Yeah, well, I think at minimum means at least one person with that kind of authority.
So they can give us lower ranking people as well, but at a minimum we want the number of the most senior person. Okay,
yes, here locally.
If that was the intent, then that's fine. I wanted to make sure that wasn't a mistake. I had a question about unaccounted for water. There's discussions in here about maintaining standards for the 15%, no more than 15% water unaccounted for. I assume that's measured by basically measuring the amount of water that leaves the treatment plant or the well and subtracting the amount of water that's metered and determining what's left. But my understanding is that under this agreement, water that's used by the city for fire protection or street cleaning or the emergencies is not charged to the city. Does that imply that it's not metered either? And I assume when the fire department goes out and opens a hydrant, they're not metering that water.
Typically not metered, although I think under this agreement, as well as the predecessor agreement, the company has the right to meter that water. In an emergency, it would not. That's not the kind of thing that would happen.
So I guess my question is if we're not metering this water, how can you calculate how much is lost? Is that usage so negligible compared to leakage and other ways that water is lost that
I'll let the operational people answer that.
You were correct in assuming that what we produce, what goes out of the plant, is balanced on what we bill through the meters. The unaccounted for water is the use of hydrants and the use of those. That's what's factored into the unaccounted for water. It's not necessarily water that we lose through the system. It's through the uses of fire protection and sweep sweepers and those kinds of things.
But I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood the agreement. I thought
combined with leakage.
Right, combined with leakage.
Is it the case? I guess what I'm getting at is the minimum standard for unaccounted for water is a standard that the water company is expected to be held to, right?
Correct.
You're supposed to show that no more than 15%, I think it is, of the water is being lost. But if it's a city that's losing the water, how can you be accountable for that?
It's an industry standard that 15% is what is considered to be the best position for a water company to have unaccounted for water for, and that takes the consideration of the loss through the unaccounted for hydrant usage and those. In that usage, I mean, the usage for leakage is much smaller in that percentage than 15%.
It just seemed like a strange accountability situation where we're on the same page, in effect, saying the city can use all the water it wants for fire protection for free, but at the same time, you need to make sure that no more than 15% of the water is unaccounted for.
Yeah, I think the way that the numbers work out is that the firefighting type of water really is very negligible when you look at 15% of the amount that's produced and pumped by the water company. The firefighting amounts are just very little.
I mean, that was kind of what I guessed, that most of the loss was either leakage in the system or water lost during the course of maintenance or water main breaks.
As well as the water that's used during our process of treating the water as well. That's not something that we don't meter as well.
Okay, so there's water that's wasted as a result, or
It's not wasted.
I
It's just
understand what you mean.
not
It's
accounted for.
not evaporates or whatever from the tanks and so forth. Okay. A question about, I know that in some jurisdictions, water companies are requiring, or municipalities are requiring backflow prevention at meters for residential service. Are you familiar with that practice? Is that something that you have considered, or the reason I'm asking the question is I know that in some of these jurisdictions there have been considerable costs incurred either in the addition of these devices at the meter, in necessitating adding expansion tanks to residential, homes and so forth. And I know there's been issues over who's going to pay for that, and is that something that's something that is, as you feel, going to be an industry-wide practice, or are there reasons why you have not done that here?
It's a requirement of the National Plumbing Code as well as with the EPA that there is backflow preventers. We have a backflow prevention program which requires backflow prevention on fire services as well as any application on a, not necessarily residential, but on a commercial setting where there may be a potential for backflow into the system. And we track those and analyze those annually.
But this would be a scenario, I mean, there are jurisdictions, am I correct, where they're essentially requiring backflow prevention on every metered service?
The state of Illinois, as Brendan described it, the Illinois EPA requires backflow prevention on basically customers that have a hazardous type situation that could cause a problem with backflow. They do not require every residential meter to have one, and I'm not aware of states that do. I do know there are some new types of replacement for water heaters that have some expansion that can come back, and I have heard of some.
Well, in some cases those have been required because, and perhaps it's not states, perhaps it's just municipalities that have required backflow prevention at the meter for residential services. And if it's not...
That may be how certain municipalities are accommodating the state's requirement rather than having to do the surveys every year and determine who is
okay.
the customer.
I'm not aware of this. I'm not aware of this being an issue in Illinois yet, but I just wanted to. If it's your impression that basically you wouldn't do that unless it was required by the state, I think it's a pretty safe bet we're not going to see the state doing that anytime in the near future. So I think that answers my question. I don't have to ask who's going to pay for it then if it's not going to be required. I think that answers my questions. I just had a couple of comments. I was really happy with this agreement when I read it. I think it's a very reasonable agreement. I think it's very pragmatic in that it looks at addressing some things that we've actually had problems with, some things that are likely to be problems, and maybe it doesn't address every contingency, but I think we do have some protection at law and through the state regulatory system against truly egregious conduct that's going to threaten the safety of the water. I think we talked about agreement or enforcement and so forth, and what's the most powerful aspect of this agreement, the most powerful asset of this agreement. I think the most powerful asset is that it represents an agreement. I mean, that this is an agreement between the city and the water company to say this is how we're going to work together, and I think that's something that was lacking in the previous agreement. And I think the likelihood that either the city or the water company has to enforce this agreement against the other is really low. I think the real benefit from this agreement is going to be that it does set forth sort of prior understanding in the way that we've agreed to work together. One of the things I was very happy to see was the information sharing provisions. Clearly, it's expensive for the water company when damage to facilities happens because of, for example, city action and vice versa. And I think to the extent that we can, get everybody in the field, whether they're working for city public works or other agencies that we work with, or whether they're working for the water company, on the same page in terms of where the facilities are and how they're to be treated, that's going to be a benefit to both parties. And the final comment I had was related to the sort of issue of whether utilities should be privately or publicly owned, and several of the other councilmen have said, maybe we should look at that. And I just wanted to put this into context. Our neighbors enjoy sometimes calling us the People's Republic of Urbana, And I think one of the ways in which that moniker is very inappropriate is that more so than any community I've ever seen or heard of, Urbana has always had a very strong emphasis on private ownership of utilities. I mean, if you look at the services that we have, telephone, cable, electrical service, gas, even things like trash pickup, which are in many areas the province of the city, maintenance of the larger sewers and the sewer treatment plant. I mean, virtually every service in Urbana except the paving of the streets and the maintenance of the smallest of the sewers is provided by one of many private utilities. And I would say that if we're going to have a discussion over whether public ownership or private ownership is more appropriate, it's something that should probably be done in the larger context of all these other utilities, rather than just focusing on something like water, who's, on water. Personally, I think that if you look at that list of companies that have been providing service to Urbana for as long as I can remember, some are better than others, and my personal feeling has been that the service provided by Northern Illinois Water and successors has been pretty good. And so I would say I'd certainly be interested in hearing arguments for and against private ownership and public ownership of these utilities, but I think what we're talking about here is whether we're going to approve this agreement that with a company with which we seem to have had a pretty good working relationship in the past, and I'd like to stay focused on that. But I think if we were to consider Urbana getting into the utility business, I'd say we should look at this in the context of all these utilities.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Hayes.
I'd just like to ask you a question. Earlier, you spoke about the quality of the water, and you also mentioned that people pay $1 a bottle for water. If the water is equal to or better than the water that people buy in a bottle, would it be in the best interest or against the best interest of the water company to advertise like that?
I guess we've always thought that the purchase of a bottle of water is a personal choice. We're not trying to talk people out of buying a bottle of water. That's their choice. We would simply say that our water is just as good, if not better. Our water is more heavily regulated, and our water prevents tooth decay. I've heard a lot of dentists will tell you that younger children today who are raised on bottled water, they're now finding more and more cavities all of a sudden. There's some people who advocate not putting fluoride in water, but we're mandated to. But so again, that's a private, an individual choice to buy bottled water.
I just wanted to bring it to the public's attention.
Thank you.
Another question, Ms. Chenoweth?
Just an interesting factoid to respond to Mr. Hayes, that that the Consumer Reports has actually said that bottled water across the nation is inferior to water that you get through tap water, because tap water is regulated by the EPA and bottled water is regulated by the FDA, and the FDA has lower standards in water than the EPA. So we have a history of having some of the best water in the nation here in Champaign-Urbana, and I think we certainly can say, based on what's out there, that it's better than what you pay $1 for in the store. May not be as pretty, but
maybe they'll start bottling it. Any other questions on the agreement? Not a motion would be in order.
I move approval.
I second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? No discussion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Thank you, folks, for coming. And Well, this agreement has been a long time coming, and there have been things we haven't been able to agree on. I think our staff enjoys the working relationship, and I know you've done a lot in the last few years to upgrade the service in Urbana with a new water tower and redundant water lines and so forth, so that we have multiple sources of water in the system. So we certainly appreciate the working relationship and hope to keep it on as good a relationship in the future. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, next, under new business, is an ordinance amending the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois with respect to over-occupancy of dwelling units and overall enforcement of the zoning ordinance. This was plan case number 1914-T-04. And Libby, are you going to start off? And Curtis will have the staff report first, and then you'll have a chance to have your comment if you're still interested in making comments.
This text amendment is designed to improve the city's ability to enforce residential occupancy limits. It would clarify and facilitate the authority of the zoning administrator and city attorney in this respect, and would increase the maximum fines for all zoning violations. It was drafted by the city attorney and came out of discussions with the University Neighborhood City Group, the UNC Group, which is a group that's been meeting for the last several months and addressing a number of issues related to the West Urbana neighborhood, university relationships, and several issues related to over-occupancy. Members of the UNC Group include myself, Mayor Satterthwaite, Councilmember Pat, who is there as a representative of the tenant union, the co-coordinators of the West Urbana Neighborhood Association, Liz Cardman and Lisa Truhl, other members of WUNA, including Mr. Pettyjohn, and several members of the University of Illinois. And in that group, as I mentioned, we talked about lots of concerns and ideas, including those dealing with over-occupancy in this area and other areas. So this particular text amendment was one of the solutions that we addressed, among others, including the affidavit that was mentioned earlier in Ms. Cardman's communication, posting, other ways to get a handle on a difficult, very difficult issue. In summary, the text amendment would make changes to the zoning ordinance so as to make it explicitly unlawful to offer to lease property or any part of a structure, which would then result in occupancy higher than allowed by the zoning ordinance. As far as the fees go, those would be set at a minimum of $50, and the maximum fee per day per violation would increase from $500 to $1,000 per day. So that's an increase. And then also would introduce the concept of escalating fines for repeat violators, going on a conviction basis from no less than $500 for the first, then $750 for the second conviction, and $1,000 for subsequent. The proposed amendment's broken into 5 different parts, and in the memoranda here, I've included the complete section of the zoning ordinance, and the changed text is underlined and removed text is struck out. The first part includes changes to the definition section to exclude the exclusion of household, to eliminate the exclusion of household servants in that definition of occupancy. And this, in our discussion at Plan Commission, was raised and then after the meeting as something that really is an antiquated concept, and further could be used as a loophole that state, well, this additional person is our servant here, and we felt that really that person needed to be counted as a full-fledged part of the household. So those are changes to the definition section. The second part, property owner responsibility, again, is to make it unlawful explicitly to offer to lease a part of a structure. And what we're trying to do here is create additional responsibility on the part of the property owner to do what they can to prevent over-occupancy by not offering leases that result in over-occupancy or, double leases or, different maneuvers that have been used and that do result in over-occupancy. We know that there is a responsibility here both for the tenants and for the property owner, and we feel that this is something that will help us particularly in enforcing the property owner's responsibility in this respect. The third part on the clarification of the zoning administrator's duties, what we're doing here on page 6 is just relocating text. That's what's struck. We're not losing that text, just putting it in a more appropriate portion of the zoning ordinance. And then on page 7, we would add the provision that a notice requirement is not a prerequisite. And what this is, as prior to administrative or court actions, and what this would allow us to do is correct situations where the over-occupancy situation is corrected, and then we have to do notice again, and then the additional occupant moves out, and then we're never able to get to court. So it's sort of a loophole, particularly with this provision. Ordinarily, however, in administering the zoning ordinance, we would, of course, provide notice, and that wouldn't change that practice. But in the cases where we have over-occupancy, person moves out, and then it comes back, and in the meanwhile, we have to go back and do noticing. We can never get relief in that situation. Fourth part, adjustment of fines. In this section, we have the relocated text. Felt that this was a better section of the ordinance. And then on the top of page 8, we've introduced the changed amounts, where we go from $500 to no more than $1,000, and then we have the escalating fines for subsequent convictions. The fifth part relates to the historic preservation portion of the zoning ordinance. We initially included this to indicate that there were no changes proposed to the fines that are set in this section, because, of course, we're at this point trying to encourage additional use of the historic preservation status and not wanting to penalize violations. We don't really experience violations of that ordinance, and in the process of presenting this, we had from Plan Commissioners improvements to the language that were presented there on the top of page 10. Summary findings in this case is that the amendment will assist in the administration and enforcement of the ordinance. The amendment is consistent with goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan calling for neighborhood preservation. The amendment addresses concerns about chronic over-occupancy of rental properties experienced in parts of Urbana and is a direct outgrowth of the work of the UNC group. It would remove language regarding household servants that is antiquated and may be abused for purposes of over-occupancy. It would make it unlawful to offer to lease property in such a way as to result in over-occupancy, thereby placing additional responsibility upon property owners. It would help to clarify and facilitate the zoning administrator and city attorney's responsibilities in enforcing these provisions. It would introduce the concept of escalating fines for repeat offenders, and would increase maximum zoning violation fees, thereby assisting in the efficacy of enforcement efforts. The options for City Council would be to approve the proposed text amendment as presented, to approve as modified by specific suggested changes, or to deny the proposed text amendment. And this was discussed at the Plan Commission, and lengthy discussion on January 6th, talked about a lot of different issues pertaining to over-occupancy, but did hear a lot of community support for the amendment, and the Plan Commission did recommend unanimously the approval of the amendment. Earlier this evening, Mr. Omosagi had some questions. Well, how do you determine over-occupancy? And it is very difficult, but we do have some methodologies that our housing inspector uses. He visits the site, interviews the tenants or the people there. He reviews leases. He looks for evidence of number of occupants, mailbox names in the mailbox, numbers of beds, evidence that would suggest how many people are residing there, and of course reviewing the lease document. And so those are methods that we use, and then there's some other more like record searching methods that we can use as well. And Mr. Omosagi was saying, well, what if one of my tenants has a guest there? Then, am I going to be in trouble for this? And really, we're looking for residents, not visitors. What's a resident? Well, a resident might be indicated by somebody who's using that address as their legal address. Maybe they're using it for voter registration, school registration, and that would help to determine who is actually resident as opposed to a visitor? And very, very good questions, because this is, particularly in the West Urbana neighborhood, is transient. But I would just say, and I've received a lot of phone calls about this from property owners, that, if you are making it clear in your leases that there will be abidance with our occupancy limits, and you're not presenting leases that encourage over-occupancy, then there's really, nothing to fear in this change. And we are just making it clearer and placing some additional responsibility. But really, in speaking to several, they do not rent to more than 4 unrelated persons, and they're just concerned about those cases where there may be a visitor, or there may be over-occupancy without their knowledge. That was another concern. That concludes the staff report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Yes, Ms. Pat?
I have one question, although we might need Mr. Holtz, maybe Ms. Tyler can answer. Oh, there he is.
Looks like.
On page 8 of section 2, when it talks about the fines for repeat offenders, it says that the fine for a second conviction related to the same property or dwelling unit, as the case may be, and then again it uses the same language, the third conviction related to the same property. What if it's the same owner, but an individual who owns several properties and is violating the law at several different properties? So this year you get them for violation at their property on Illinois Street. Next year, when you get them for their property on Kohler, is that going to be, the way this reads, that will not be treated like a repeat violation, even though it's another year. And I see Mr. Holtz nodding his head, that's right, it's not. Would there be any legal problem with changing it so that it would be that an individual who violates the law more than once, regardless of which property they do that at, is getting a second conviction and a third conviction, et cetera?
The difficulty with tying it to the owner but not to the property is one of differences between the two different properties. I think we could. It's something that we could try to do. That is, say, once a particular property owner who owns a dozen different properties, once he's gotten one notice about one of those properties, that counts as his first notice under this language. And then if he gets another violation at a different property than the first one, then he gets kicked up to the second level. I guess where the difficulty comes in is that there are times where different types of properties might have different kinds of physical characteristics that could lead someone to conclude that the property would be treated differently for occupancy situations. And the concern you raise is one that was brought up to me after the meeting of the Plan Commission, when the Plan Commission considered this. And I think there's Glenn Berman back there. Glenn Berman is the one who raised it to me, and as well as you, Ms. Pat, after that meeting. It's something that we could try, and I guess the way to deal with any potential legal infirmity with that kind of language would be for me to use my discretion. If I really felt like the first instance didn't really carry over in a fair way to the second instance, then I could just treat it as a first violation. But by and large, I think it's something that is workable under the language or under the approach you're suggesting. So that is that if we put in language
Well, I wonder if we just took out the words related to the same property, if that would, in that section 2, I'm on page 8, under Article 11, Section 11-1, subsection 2, that, or A2, where you've got the statement of the fines, you say for first conviction of any provision of zoning ordinance, $750. For a second conviction related to the same property, if we just took out the words related to the same property, that would say for a second conviction. Would that
that might well do it.
Okay. I don't mean to be argumentative about it. It's just that since the violation is to offer to lease, I mean the wrong words here, that it shall be unlawful to offer to lease, sell, convey, use, or build upon any lot or any part of a structure if the effect of the action is to do these different things. So offering to lease isn't really specific to the property in the same way as occupancy is my thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. So in order to make that happen the way you're suggesting, you would delete after the number 750, it continues on for a second conviction, and then from there you delete the words related to the same property or dwelling unit as the case may be. And then likewise, after the $1,000, you'd have the same kind of deletion. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
I think that's workable.
And just a reminder that this particular language would apply to pretty much any zoning violation, so we need to consider other cases too.
But that wouldn't preclude it being at the same property. This would just leave it open to, if it were the same violation, different properties. Is that right? Well, think about it while we have discussion. This is just questions. That's all I had. Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Chenoweth?
Yeah, there's been, I think, a lot of misunderstanding about this, at least some of the calls that I've gotten from people who own property in Urbana. So let me just, I think you said this before, let me put it in super plain speak. If John owns a house and he rents it to 4 people, and in that lease it says no more than 4 people may live here, and he understands that he has a legal relationship with these 4 unrelated adults, and one of his tenants has their girlfriend move in and put her name on the box and start receiving mail, John is not responsible, because he's only responsible for the lease that he makes with his tenants. Is that correct or incorrect under the new amendment?
You want to?
Yeah, can I answer that?
Steve may have an answer too.
Because this is the question.
If that's what really happened, then no, the landlord's not responsible because the landlord did not offer the place to lease to more than 4 people. If 5 people came to look at the house and the landlord showed it to all 5, and the landlord provides 5 bedrooms that are furnished with 5 beds and 5 desks and 5 dressers, and the landlord gave 5 credit applications and ran 5 credit checks, and then only put 4 names on the lease, that's what this is trying to get at. And Steve can give the legal answer, but that's just, as far as where this came from, that's what it's all about.
I think Ms. Pat hit it pretty well.
I think that's pretty clear. And then a question, it was my understanding that that landlords could not enter into leases with more than 4 unrelated people in the past in Urbana. Is that correct or is that not correct?
That's correct.
No, excuse me, no, that's not correct.
They're not lawfully.
There's no law about entering into leases. The law is, and that's what landlords have told tenants for the last at least 23 years, since the last time West Urbana Neighborhood Association asked the city to enforce this, is that the law prohibits more than 4 names on a lease. And there's no law anywhere that says you can't have more than 4 names on a lease. The zoning law prohibits occupancy of a single-family home by more than 4 unrelated adults.
It hasn't been illegal to sign a lease with 6 unrelated adults until now in the city of Urbana.
Not to sign the lease, but to let them live in the house is illegal. I mean, maybe it sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but that is an important distinction.
I see. I think that's clear, and I think that kind of answers some of the questions Gabe raised, and certainly questions that I've received in terms of phone calls, particularly because I hear from homeowners who or landowners who spend a lot of time trying to enforce occupancy and can't, or, in the same situation the city's been in for a while, which is running around trying to count beds, and it's a very slippery situation.
Just to clarify then, what we're doing, the loophole we're closing here is if a landlord enters into a lease previously if a landlord entered into a lease with 5 or 6 unrelated adults, it wasn't a violation until they all moved in. Now it's a violation to enter into that lease.
Okay, so I think I just have one more question, which is that just so I understand clearly, if two women who have a lifetime commitment to one another and they have two foster children from different families living with them, they can't rent out their spare room. Is that correct? I mean, the situation is, that would be correct under this, so there'd be, I'm just trying to give a scenario. Pardon me?
The scenarios. There's only two
Yeah,
adults.
that's two. You need to add some
Oh, okay,
roommates, too.
two
If
unrelated adults.
If two people who were in a committed relationship and not legally married right now had 3 additional roommates who were adults with whom they had no relationship, that would be a violation.
Okay.
But if they had 100 children, that, well, 100 because of occupancy, but if they had 4 children, that would not, or 6 children, it wouldn't matter, because this isn't about children, it's about unrelated adults.
Okay, that helps. Let me just finish my question, which is, could we, under section 1, number 1, these aren't page, I guess I'm looking at the second page of the, after the whereases.
In the actual ordinance itself.
In the actual ordinance itself, could we say a basic group of persons consisting of one or more persons related by blood, adoption, or marriage, and every time there's the word marriage, say, recognized here or in other states or countries? Just because I think the question of marriage is actually not, it's up for debate right now. It's unclear. And so, for example, the 2 Urbana men who went to Canada to get married, who have been in a lifetime committed relationship and return and live in Urbana, would not be covered under this as married, as I understand it, without that clarification, even though they're married in Canada. Or similarly, we've had the situation, because we have a lot of internationals in this community, I've heard of situations from constituents where their marriages aren't recognized in the United States because of paperwork, and vice versa. We've had people from Urbana actually go to, I think it was Switzerland, I was just hearing the other day, and his marriage to a woman was not recognized in Switzerland. So situations where marriages are not recognized, whether it be same-sex or opposite sex, could we add a provision that makes it clear that if you have marriage papers that show that you're married in some state or some country, then you're considered a married couple under this provision?
Is marriage isn't defined in this as right now?
No, it's not.
I just checked.
So, I mean, we could add a definition of marriage. The dwelling unit is defined, so it could be added into the definition, I suppose. There be any problem with that?
Might be a problem for tonight, although not necessarily for at another meeting. This being a zoning ordinance change, that kind of change is probably outside the notice that's been given for a proposed change to the zoning ordinance, and so it would probably have to go back to the Plan Commission first to meet our procedural requirements.
Adding a definition would be outside of the purview of this.
It's advertised, when we start up a zoning case like this, we advertise for certain narrow parameters, and if we go outside those parameters, then we need to renotice to give people the public notice that this is being considered for an action. And so if they have any comment that they have, that they're made aware of, that this is something we're considering.
In other words, there is nothing in the notices that were first given that would really suggest that we're going to start changing the definitions, and without comment from me at all about what. I've got no opinion on whether or not it's a good idea or bad idea. I just don't think it's fairly within the scope of what we've noticed up as a possible change.
Not at this point, thank you.
Okay. Ms. Wyman, then Mr. Alex.
I have one follow-up question on Ms. Chenoweth's question, and then another issue, I guess similarly related. That is that since marriage is not defined in this ordinance, I guess first question is it just open to interpretation? And so Mr. Holtz is the one who would interpret these. Could he could you or would you interpret marriage as being just any marriage that's recognized in any jurisdiction? Or do you think that because I don't know, I presume marriage is defined somewhere else in the Code of Ordinances, that you'd rely on that, and in which case then we would definitely need to have, per your recommendation, a new zoning case that would clarify what marriage, how marriage is defined?
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic rule for statutory construction, that is statutory interpretation, is you look at the plain meaning of the language, and I think it's fair to say that normally the way statutes are interpreted in Illinois, when the word marriage is used, it would be a marriage that's recognized by the state of Illinois. I'd be pretty hard-pressed to come up with a different interpretation of that, or to enforce a different interpretation of that under this language. That's not to say that we couldn't do our own definition, but that would... And even if you look at just the tenor of the conversation here, basically everybody's saying, well, it seems like it's a pretty common understanding that so far, anyway, marriage has been interpreted by everybody around here in the context of this language to mean a traditional marriage, and that's why people are talking about maybe needing to change it. So if that's what you want to do, then changing it would be the appropriate way.
Okay, and just a follow-up issue on that, I had spoken with Ms. Pat and emailed with Dr. Tyler regarding the issue where in several of the different articles there's discussion, and kind of along the lines that Ms. Chenoweth has mentioned, where we talk about consisting of one or more persons related by blood, adoption, or marriage. And I asked Dr. Tyler if there was a way just to insert domestic partnership or a domestic partner in that, so as to not discriminate against lifelong partners who did not have the legal right to marriage in this state. And what she suggested is similar to Mr. Holt's response, which is that we would need to have a new planning case or a new zoning case to address that issue. And in such a case, then we could address not only this ordinance that we're talking about tonight, but the fact that anywhere where family or marriage is discussed, or relations like that we could include a domestic partner and some definition that would go along those lines, so that again, we don't end up discriminating against people based on, or domestic partners simply because they don't have the legal right yet to marry. And so my intention then is, after this is passed, or after we deal with this tonight, I'd like to make a motion to direct the zoning administrator to set up a plan case to deal with this issue, and then, assuming it's okay with Ms. Chenoweth, then to also include in that, if possible, include or have a separate one that also better defines marriage to the interpretation that we wish it to have. Thank you.
Mr. Alex?
My discomfort, I guess, with this, and I was at the zoning plan commission hearing on this and heard all the commentary there. I think in general the ordinance change is very good, but I did have a problem with this status, and I wanted to get a clarification. I don't see the word adult in here. As far as I can tell, it reads unrelated persons, not unrelated adults. And if I'm familiar with the wrong section, I don't want to have to go through the whole zoning code tonight, but as far as I can tell, the first situation that occurred to me at the plan commission hearing that might be an issue was foster children who may not be adopted but are being fostered or in temporary custody, who are not adopted, who are not related by blood, and who are not related by marriage. And clearly it's not the intent of the zoning ordinance to limit the number of foster children who can live in a household. Likewise, with this domestic partnership issue, my understanding is that this council before has heard issues related to spousal equivalency for the purpose of benefits for city workers and so forth. And it would be my expectation that the city somewhere has a legal definition of what constitutes a spousal equivalent or a domestic partner and some legal way to establish that. Because my concern about making a change here saying, or domestic partners or marriage is recognized in any state or country and so forth, is that to be, enforceable, something like this has to be consistent. And I would, personally be very supportive of the zoning ordinance recognizing some form of spousal equivalency or domestic partnership. But I think it needs to be done in a way that's consistent with other ordinances of the city. And I think as a city we need to make sure that when we're discussing this concept from whether it's a human rights standpoint or a employment discrimination standpoint or a legislative standpoint, we do it consistently. And so I guess I would like to ask if we are, my preference would be, I think this is a good ordinance. I don't think this is declaring, war on boyfriends spending the night over. I don't think that this is egregiously burdensome on landlords. I think if a landlord only leases to 4 people and somebody's girlfriend moves in and stays there for a year with her name on the mailbox, openly living there, and the landlord has at least reasonable constructive knowledge of her presence, I would think that the landlord could be liable for allowing 5 people to live in that house. But I would say the standard for that would have to be pretty high. I mean, clearly I think a landlord who can show that in good faith they signed a lease with 4 people and they didn't know this person was living there, and there's not overwhelming evidence that they should have known or should have known this person was living there, I think they're going to be okay. But I don't want to send the message that as long as you only put 4 names on the lease, the city can't come after you. Is that a fair understanding? That it's basically, one has to be knowingly permitting or facilitating over occupancy to be liable, but that merely having only 4 names on a lease does not eliminate your liability if it's obvious that your property is being overoccupied.
Yeah, it's fair to say that you can't, a landlord can't avoid liability under this language simply by restricting the lease to 4 names. If the landlord, it's kind of like what Ms. Pat was suggesting earlier, if the landlord shows the place to 5 people and then says, well, then you can all live here, but I can only have 4 names on the lease, well, then the landlord's violating this ordinance.
I just don't want the council to be on record as saying that as long as you only have 4 names on the lease, it's okay, because that's kind of what got us into this mess in the first place.
Right now. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, that's really the loophole that we're trying to close here.
Okay, so I guess if we're comfortable with that, my preference personally would be to see this approved tonight, and then to see this issue of blood persons related by blood adoption or marriage dealt with in a larger context, whether it's a separate plan case or whether it's a plan case in conjunction with other text amendments to the zoning ordinance, which happen from time to time. I think it would be appropriate to look at it and decide, if the city elsewhere treats some form of domestic partnership or spousal equivalent that's documentable and substantiatable as equivalent to marriage, obviously the same thing should happen here. And likewise, if it's possible to determine the status of whether this is correct in the sense of foster children or children in temporary custody and things like that, because I always thought it was unrelated adults as well, but I may be confusing it with another ordinance because I couldn't find the word adult in here.
Yeah, well, I see what you mean. It says right here, basic family group together with not more than 3 additional persons not related by blood. And it's repeated other places as well. So, our interpretation has always been that this is adults and not people. So does it say adults somewhere, or how do we?
No, it doesn't. And that's a good point. I never really noticed it that way because adults' children would all be related by blood adoption. But in one section, this is on page 3 of your memo, under dwelling duplex extended group occupancy, there's language regarding foster children, but Ms. Tyler pointed to me that's not consistent for single family home, but I think that's what you're probably getting.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's clear that some cleanup here might be in order, and I don't necessarily think it's germane to whether or not this should be passed tonight, but I would think and be supportive of a motion to ask the staff to look at making this consistent with the intent expressed by other ordinances of the city.
Yeah, I was just wondering, as far as the adult language, is that something that we could address within the context of this particular zoning change as it has to do with over-occupancy, or would that be best addressed in a new plan case?
I think it'd be best in a new plan case.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Mr. Hayes, then Mr. Roberts.
No more than 4 unrelated adults. And so I just want you to think about something. I don't want you to change it. But some of these folks in Champaign-Urbana got some large family. Uncles, aunts, cousins, grandmother, grandfather. And so they would be related.
I think the no more than 4 unrelated adults is too simple a summary of it. Just going back to the single-family dwelling, it says a group of persons consisting of one or more persons related by blood, adoption, or marriage, living and cooking together as a single housekeeping unit. So that's your family, and it could include grandpa, aunt, uncle, grandson, cousin. It could, because they're related by blood, and there could be several of them. In addition, there could be, together with not more than 3 additional persons, and we might say adult persons, or we might modify that, not related by blood, adoption, or marriage. So in the large family, say an extended family situation, then that would be the roommates or the roomers or the friend or the, extra room in the attic situation. So I think the definition is broad enough to cover most familial relationships, but there are some that could be excluded, and we want to work to include those. So,
Roberts?
I was just thrown by a single word, and it was in section 2 of this, I guess it's the ordinance part. I guess it's the 1, 2, 3, the 4th page. It says, except as provided in Article 10 of this ordinance, it shall be unlawful to offer to lease, which had been underlined.
I'm sorry, could you?
Okay, yeah, this is hard to find maybe. It's also duplicated in these little memo excerpts and earlier on.
Section 2, after the whereases.
Yes, after the whereases, it's in section 2. So it's about your 4th page of the actual ordinance.
Of what article? I'm sorry.
It'll be on the right-hand side, up towards the top.
I don't think they've gotten to articles yet.
That's not a typo.
My section 2 doesn't have any whereases in it.
No, it's after that. It's right here. Got the same page? Yes, you do. Okay. Right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do we know where we are?
I know where you're at.
Okay.
Right there.
All right, section 2. It says section 3.2, evasion of development regulations is hereby amended to read as follows. Except as provided in Article 10 of this ordinance, it shall be unlawful to offer to lease, sell, convey, use, and it goes on. And I guess the word sell sounded really odd to me because we're talking about a rental agreement or a lease. And I don't understand what selling has to do with having a lease. I think it must be a word that flew in there from somewhere else and maybe needs to be struck.
If you look below, there's other things that people could offer a property for sale in such a way that it's going to result in other zoning violations related to, floor area ratio. They may offer, I'm going to sell you this and you can put on 2 more stories. They're already at their floor area ratio limit. So it's not just the over-occupancy that this Section 2 relates to. It's all these other...
You're talking about potentially fraudulent sale based on...
Seems to me that's what that's getting at. That
seems like a whole completely different issue, and I thought it was confusing and weird, but you're saying you thought about this.
No, I'm just saying this is the part of the zoning ordinance where it made sense to put this additional limitation. And this whole text amendment covers like 4 or 5 different sections of the zoning ordinance. It's really hard to follow, but we want to make sure we get the amendments in the right locations. So if you look at the rest of that section 2, A through F relate to other issues. And so, that misinformation could be part of lots of different transactions, including lease or sale. Is it your understanding, Steve?
Yeah, that's the language that you're quoting there, Mr. Roberts, is really comprehensive language dealing with this. The word sell, convey is much of a selling word as well. Build, all that language is in there right now. The way it's phrased right now, before any amendment, is that it says lease, sell, convey, use, or build upon. We're adding only the phrase offer to lease into that. It is comprehensive, as Ms. Tyler suggests. It's designed basically as a general prohibition on all kinds of essentially use violations of the zoning ordinance. And I can't remember which one it was when we had this at the Plan Commission the other day. Somebody commented that it's kind of difficult to look at these kinds of revisions just in the context of a little memo like this, because when we're talking about the revisions, we're carving out the little parts that we're revising and we're sticking those in front of you, and you're not really looking at the entire zoning ordinance, which is I don't know how many pages long. It's a very long ordinance and complicated, and so you're kind of trying to look at it and evaluate these things without having in front of you the entire text of the ordinance and without having it all fresh in your mind. It's really difficult every time you go into the zoning ordinance, because it is really complicated and comprehensive and deals with all kinds of things. It's difficult to go in there and do little adjustments, and at the same time make sure that you don't have unintended consequences popping up in all kinds of places that you just didn't think of.
Other questions? Mr. Allen?
I just wanted to address that. I think the most likely case in which sell would be an issue there is, for example, selling off portions of a property, selling off the parking associated with a business and not leaving sufficient parking to operate the business within the zoning ordinance, or selling off 10 feet of a lot as a result of which the lot was no longer big enough to meet the floor area ratio or to have the meet the setback requirements. It's hard for me to conceive of a situation in which you could sell a property that would cause over-occupancy, but I think it can happen in a lot of these other cases, and the idea is to capture the liability not only on maybe who ends up using the land improperly, but who created the situation that made it impossible to use the land properly. I think that's why it's there, and yeah, it's kind of strange in this case, but is that fair?
Any other questions?
There is one more.
Mr. Roberts?
Who initiates the complaint? I mean, you get complaints called in, right? I mean, to start a procedure which is going to result in a fine.
Are you talking about any zoning complaint or just the over-occupancy here?
The over-occupancy.
For that type of complaint, we will investigate based on neighbor inquiries, just a suspicion. We'll do some level of investigation. We have some building code items that we look for tenant complaints, and basically depends on the situation, but if there's an inquiry, we look into it. Over-occupancy is something that impacts neighbors, and that's probably going to be our greatest source of complaints.
Any other questions, Ms. Pat?
I just wanted to respond to Mr. Roberts also. In my experience working at the tenant union, the clients I've had who were caught in violation were people who had filed a complaint themselves with the city for violation of property maintenance codes. So the slum landlord wasn't fixing the house up, and when the housing inspector showed up, the inspector asked how many people live in this house, and they told, because they didn't know it was against the law. There are 6 of us, and that's how they got caught. So that's happened in a few cases too.
And we do check on the systematic inspections. That reminded me that is something we're looking for now. We didn't talk tonight about notification. Some things we do. This year we sent out hundreds of brochures to the West Urbana neighborhood for properties that we believe were rental, with just a summary of all kinds of city rules that might pertain. Also, welcome to the neighborhood. Here are the rules, including the over-occupancy. And that was, I think, helpful. The West Urbana neighborhood has paid for display ads in the Daily Illini at the start of school, and I think they'll be doing that again. And then if this amendment is successful, we plan on doing a notification. And so those are ways that we try to remind people that this limitation exists.
Well, that's a missing part of the picture that is more heartening to know about. We're not just like trying to nail people here. We're building a neighborhood of harmony. Okay.
Any other questions? Curtis, your public input, your chance for public input has finally arrived.
3.5 hours later.
Curtis Pettyjohn, 907 South Orchard. I was on my way to Schnucks to buy food for dinner and saw the lights on and went, oh. So as many of you know, civic duty can make you hungry. Welcome, Mr. Roberts and Mr. Alex. Thank you for having this on the table, for looking at it, for tweaking it, for caring enough to tweak it. And a thank you to Dr. Tyler and to Mr. Holtz for your hard work. And Dr. Tyler, if she didn't live in my neighborhood, I would swear she lived in this building. Thank you very much for your hard work. Property owning, what goes with that is responsibility. As adults, we grow up and we have to become responsible. So far, only tenants have been held responsible for the problems and for the violation of this ordinance. It isn't a change of the ordinance, it's a change of who is responsible. And it's about time that the adults are held responsible. Thank you for looking at it, and thank you for considering it. In response to Gabe's comments about the neighborhood going Section 8, this is not about just the West Urbana neighborhood. This is about our entire city, and this is about enforcing the zoning ordinance throughout the entire city. And as far as a Mrs. Gonzalez and a Mrs. Washington, we already have those women in our neighborhood. Thank you very much. We have diversity. And race baiting and class baiting has no place at this table. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, then a motion would be in order. Ms. Wyman?
I move approval of this Plan Case 1914-T-04 as presented to us in the January 13, 2005 memo, and with the changes suggested by Ms. Pat, deleting the two identical clauses that state related to the same property or dwelling unit as the case may be. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Yes, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I'll be brief. I just want to make sure folks understand what this is about. I've been watching this, well, I've had a first-hand view of this for almost 30 years of what goes on with over-occupancy, and it's extraordinarily frustrating to see tenants continuously being the ones who suffer the loss as a result. I'm going to just pass out you a page of the classified section of the Daily Illini from Friday in January's paper. Just want to take one and pass it along. Thank you. And I went through and I highlighted in the section on houses all of the houses that are advertised as 5-bedroom, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-bedroom. There are, in today's paper, and this is not the height of the leasing season, I don't know if you all know this, but students now start shopping for apartments on October 1st for the following August, and there were a lot more house ads in the fall paper, but I didn't save enough copies of those. But even now, there are a dozen ads in last Friday's or Monday's Daily Illini for houses that are 5-bedroom, 6-bedroom, 7-bedroom, 8-bedroom. A number of these are in Champaign, and a number of them in Urbana. Looking at this, I know because I recognize addresses that a couple of these houses are actually legal rooming houses, and so it would be legal for the 10-bedroom house at 806 West Ohio to be rented to 10 individuals, or for the one at the 8-bedroom house at 707 West Springfield to be rented to 8 people. There are also some ads here for places that if the landlord rented to one adult for each bedroom that is advertised here, would be illegally occupied. the consumer, any consumer, maybe even yourself, especially the consumer who is 18 years old and has lived in town for 6 weeks, or maybe even 19 years old and has lived here for a year, would have no way of knowing, the average person would have absolutely no way of knowing that there's any law that restricts occupancy of a house to 4 people when they open the classified section of the newspaper and see so many advertisements for houses that have more bedrooms. One ad, the last one in the second column, says spacious furnished group houses and apartments for 4 to 8 people. That one actually mentions the number of people. And that, I know whose ad that is, and he does have a couple of legal rooming houses, though I don't know if all the places he's advertising are actually legally occupied that way. The way the housing market has been working for years on campus is the number of bedrooms equals the number of people. And I think if you talk to any student who shops, if you are a 3-bedroom apartment is for 3 people, a 2-bedroom apartment is for 2 people, 4-bedroom apartments for 4 people, et cetera, and that's the way the houses work too. And what has been happening for the most part, and I mentioned earlier that 22 years ago, West Urbana Neighborhood Association made a fuss here at the city about enforcement of the law, and it was at that point that landlords started, some landlords, many landlords started telling tenants that it's against the law to put more than 4 names on a lease. And they would only put 4 names on the lease, but the amount of rent would be 6 people's rent. And what happens when, and this is what I've seen even the last few years, when someone gets caught violating the law, whether it's because they called the housing inspector and then inadvertently turned themselves in, or when any of my neighbors have called the city complaining and the city has found more than 4 unrelated people occupying a house, the additional people have to move out. And the way the law has worked up until now is if the additional people move out, which I think they always do, then the violation doesn't exist anymore, so nobody's fined, not the landlord, not the tenant. And so the same landlords have been renting the same houses in violation of the law year after year after year after year with no consequence. The only consequence is to the tenants, and if the tenants were chumped into putting only 4 names on the lease when there were 6 people, after the 2 extra leave, the 4 remaining people have to pay 6 people's rent, which is very unfair. Or they can have a legal battle. Even when there are 6 names on the lease, they might have a legal battle if the landlord tries to collect the rent, 6 people's rent after 2 had to leave. So the intention here, and this is just one step, this will not solve the whole problem, but the intention here is to hold responsible the property owner who should know the law if the property owner continues to rent a place year after year to more than 4 unrelated adults. And I'm hoping that the landlords who have been doing this are going to change their behavior and not risk getting caught offering a place to lease, because if they do offer it, they will have violated the law, and that would mean giving out the 6 credit applications or accepting the 6 rent checks or telling the people, yes, you could have 6 people. One last thing, as far as the visiting guest, separate from this issue, that's something that comes up in landlord-tenant relations a lot, where a landlord rents to 2 people, then it seems there's a 3rd person living there. What's going on? The way to establish whether or not that person's a legal resident is to require, if the landlord wants to challenge it, is to require the person to prove their residence. And if they really live someplace else, it's none of anyone's business whether they sleep over every night. And if they can't prove legal residence anyplace else, it doesn't matter what story they make up. If they're there and they can't prove they live anywhere else, that's where they live. And this goes back, when I started working at the tenant union, this was an issue that came up some with the housing authority, because they're concerned about the income, the rent is set by income in public housing and in Section 8. And so if there's an extra person living there, that person's income should be counted in determining affordability. And that's how, and I've dealt with it from the tenant side, how do you deal with it? They claim my boyfriend's living here, he's not. Can you prove where your boyfriend's living? Well, he's got a lease. That's what you need to go show the housing authority. And that always worked, and I think that will continue to work. Also, in houses, there might be more problems with the extra person living there than in apartments, because, if that's even the case, because landlords who are violating the law are, leave things kind of mushy in terms of their communication with the tenants about who can live there and who can't. I see so many leases that say no persons can be living here other than those stated on the lease for apartments, and I think we'll see more landlords doing that with their leases for houses if we can get them with the program that there is an occupancy limit and they're supposed to comply with it, because they'll be concerned about being seen as a violator when they're not, and they'll probably do a better job of communicating to people, you really can't have more than 4 people here, rather than just saying, well, I don't care who lives in the house, or whatever it is they say to let people know it's okay to break the law, which it's not. Thank you.
Any other discussion on this? Ms. Chenoweth?
Just on the topic of the domestic partners, I think that it's in the city's best interest for this plan case, which has gone through a certain process, to continue moving forward, even though there are 2 outstanding issues, one with the word adults and the other with domestic partners, especially same-sex domestic partners who don't have the option of marriage as a way to establish a relationship that then the city can acknowledge in some way when enforcing laws. And I think that on that topic, in looking at this is just one of many places in which we talk about issues of relationship between people. And so I think instead of this coming up every single time we look at something that talks about relationships between people, I think the city of Urbana needs to determine for itself what kind of relationships are we going to want to acknowledge, so that we can move forward and not penalize people who aren't breaking the spirit of the law, even though they may be breaking the letter of the law, for example. So I think perhaps the easiest, most efficient, kind of least painful way of moving forward with that is for the city of Urbana to consider a domestic partner registry, which takes some of the work that we already did looking at domestic partner benefits for city employees, and basically allows people to come in and register their relationships. By registering their relationships, lots of things can happen. Employers like my business, because I'm it's the only business I know of that does this, provides full domestic partner benefits. And it would be great for us to be able to go to the city hall just like any other business and say, are these people registered domestic partners? Yes, they are. Okay. Similarly, the city can enforce things based on domestic partners, and not get into the business necessarily of I think what always becomes difficult is figuring out whether or not somebody is a temporary dating relationship or a long-term partner. So I think there are real ways to determine that via shared expenses and living wills and all powers of attorney and things like that. And it would be useful to do it once, and that helps the city, and that helps the private sector who want to provide those benefits as well, and kind of centralize it in one place. And then at that point, we can look at adding domestic partners as a relationship across the board.
Any other discussion? Ms. Wyman?
Not to get too far off topic, I agree with Ms. Chenoweth on one, and I think perhaps the best route to go is, after this is passed, on the next, we could do it, since Ms. Chenoweth is chair of the next committee, is to put domestic partner registry as a discussion item, and so if she's agreeable, council members can begin to prepare for that discussion with regard to the zoning ordinance and recognizing as familial relationships, marriages that are recognized in any jurisdiction, and domestic partners as well as also familial relationships, since that's got to go through a separate process, since it's through the zoning case, which I think it'd probably be better to do a separate direction, or basically move that separately. And hopefully those will come back. Both of those issues will come to fruition as quickly as possible, so that Urbana can move forward in recognizing equal rights and marriage equality, or as close to that as the city can come. Those are my only comments regarding Ms. Chenoweth's issue, and I certainly support this plan case and appreciate all of the staff's work and especially Ms. Pat's work on this issue as well. Thank you.
Is there any other discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 6 ayes Next, we have ordinance, item number 3 under new business, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute a permanent easement. This is for SBC Ameritech. Mr. Gray is going to present this.
Real quick, at the Stratford building site, last month we learned that SBC Ameritech needed to have an easement along the site to service this property and to, in the future, service any future development that may occur north of the site or east of the site. So we have been meeting with SBC, the future property owners, developers, to work this out, and what we're asking for here is that the mayor be granted the authority to sign the final dedication document for granting an easement to SBC to provide service to this facility and to run lines in the future to property to the north and or east. And that's what we're here this evening for.
Hey, are there any questions about this?
Just to clarify, the east property line, that would be basically in Race Street?
What was meant in this memo was the east property line of city lot, parking lot number 8, which is adjacent to the Jolly Roger's restaurant, or immediately in the west wall of the Jolly Roger restaurant.
Okay, so the lot between the Stratford development and the Jolly Roger.
Well, that is the Stratford lot.
There's no
intervening lot.
There's no intervening space. No, I understand, but the
line.
It's the east property line of the Stratford lot.
Stratford's not going to touch the Jolly Roger, right?
It does.
Oh, it does?
The lot does.
No, not the building, though.
The building does not.
Okay, and the city's going to continue to own that property between the two?
No. No, the city will convey parking lot 8 to Tim Ponies.
So you can.
The attached map wasn't here, so I didn't understand what was
there is
what we were looking at.
Let me provide a little context.
Anyway, this memo's changed as of yesterday afternoon. So actually, the easement's going to be granted along the west lot line and the south lot line of the site.
And why are we providing the easement instead of the landowner?
We own the land.
We own it right now.
Yes.
And it will be transferred to the, okay.
Yes.
So I didn't know.
And then the point is that upon the transfer will occur with the easement.
I understand.
Apologize for that. I'm not sure.
Any other questions? If not, a motion would be in order.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion is second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Mayor Satterthwaite?
Oh, yes. Did Mr. Hayes get a chance to vote on that?
Yes, he did.
That motion carries with 7 ayes. Next, we have a couple of appointments to boards and commissions. To the Plan Commission, it's my pleasure to recommend Mr. John Cooper for your approval. He lives at 1405 West Beardsley. He's currently the Assistant Highway Engineer for Champaign County, position he's held since 2001. Before that, he was an engineer with the Illinois Department of Transportation. He's a longtime resident of Urbana, has been an active community member, has served on the Urbana Community Alternative Policing Advisory Committee, and First String, which is an organization that does baseball, basketball, and so forth for young kids up in the King School neighborhood. And his term, if approved, would expire June 30th, 2007. And to the Civil Service Commission, Mr. Willard Broom of 801 South Race. Mr. Broom's a retired Dean of Students at the U of I, where he was responsible for assisting student organizations, fraternities, sororities, student government, and a variety of other jobs and responsibilities. He's a 31-year resident of Urbana, a member of the University YMCA Board, and has volunteered in the Urbana Park District as a coach for youth sports. And his term, if approved, would expire June 30th, 2007. Any questions about these? If not, a motion would be in order. Ms. Lyon?
I move approval of the appointments of Plan Commissioner, for Plan Commission John Cooper and for Civil Service Commission Willard Broom.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.